A faint breath drifts through the quiet, like a tide inhaling the edges of an old memory. Nothing rises sharply, nothing calls for attention. It is only the soft motion of a world turning a page, the gentle shift of a dream tethered to the hush of salt air. In that calm unfolding, a coastline comes into view, pale, muted, and shimmering with the faintest blue glow, as though someone brushed moonlight onto the edges of the sand and forgot to let it dry. The water moves with patient rhythm, and the breeze carries the cool scent of minerals, deep currents, and something older than history. You feel the air thicken slightly, as if listening with you to the quiet story about to form. Tonight, the tide carries us toward a long-forgotten place once known by travelers of the deep ocean as Lumarai, the isle where the water itself kept time. The shore lies almost weightless beneath a veil of morning mist, but there is no sun, only the impression of soft silver light diffusing from everywhere and nowhere. The cliffs around the island curve like gentle crescents, shaped not by violence but by centuries of tender erosion. Serenity lingers here the way dew lingers on leaves that never see heat. It is a world that rewrites itself with every wave. Far along the shoreline, translucence shimmers beneath the waves. Slender formations rising like candle flames carved out of glass. These are not corals, not ice, not stone. The people who once lived here called them tide columns, pale vertical ribbons that glow faintly with each incoming swell. Their patterns are as delicate as breathing, expanding, contracting, softening, brightening. The ocean seems to speak through them without ever making a sound. A silent metronome, a pulse beneath the waterline. The civilization that made Lumarai their home were the tide keepers, a community so attuned to the rhythms of the sea that they structured their entire existence around the subtle pulse of the planet. They lived in dwellings carved into the gentle slopes, half exposed to the air, half embraced by stone. Every surface was smoothed by hand, not polished into perfection, but shaped into forms that encouraged calm attention. Their world moved slowly because they believed the ocean revealed its meaning only to those who chose to mirror its patience. The tide keepers were not builders of monuments or vast structures. Their legacy was quieter, woven into rituals, careful observations, and journals of fine markings etched into drifting wood. They believed that time was not a straight line, but a tide, rising and falling in cycles, revealing truths only when the mind flowed with it rather than against it. Their days began not with sunrise, but with the first faint brightening of the water columns, and their nights ended when those same columns dimmed like embers cooling. The heart of their knowledge lay in the practice known as tide mapping. Rather than charting stars above, they charted the rhythms below, the slight variations in wave height, beam patterns, subsurface luminescence, and the whisper-like currents brushing against the shores. Each shift in water pressure, each fluctuation in the glow of the columns, each echo in the sand beneath, these were signals. To them, the ocean was a vast moving equation, and they had dedicated centuries to understanding its quiet arithmetic. But this was not science in the modern sense, nor mysticism. It was an integrated attention, a contemplative science where observation merged with stillness. Tide mapping was done in silence. An apprentice would sit on the soft stones at the edge of the shore and wait until their breath matched the pattern of the nearest wave. Only then could they begin marking the faint pulses in the glow of the water columns, the way a monk might copy the gradual flicker of a candle. What they discovered, in their calm centuries of listening, was a phenomenon modern oceanography now recognizes in fragments. Subtle oscillations in tidal patterns that correspond with tectonic microchanges deep below the crust. What scientists today might measure through satellites and pressure sensors, the tide keepers felt through bare feet, fingertips, and quiet breath. Their records, if ever found, might resemble the data we plot in long-span time series graphs, patterns of small disturbances that converge into rhythms too slow for hurried minds to notice. A modern physicist might recognize in their practice the principles of resonance, boundary wave interference, and harmonic oscillation. A geologist would see the shadow signatures of bathymetric changes and deep ocean thermal shifts. A mathematician would recognize repeating ratios hidden in their carvings. But to the tide keepers, it was simpler, gentler. They believed the earth hummed softly beneath them, and the sea was the way that hum became visible. There is something deeply soothing about that idea. The planet as a calm singer, each ocean a quiet instrument. The notion that tides are not just forces but messages. Slow communication between the world above and the world below. And that the act of listening, truly listening, requires a kind of stillness rarely practiced today. Sitting on their shore, one imagines how the world must have felt to them. A tide that shifts like memory itself. Waves that fold the edges of the day until only the gentle center remains. Light that brushes the surface of the sea the way a thought brushes the edge of consciousness before drifting away again. The tide keepers believed the glow of the columns reflected something internal as well, an alignment between a person's breath and the world's movement. To observe the tides was to observe themselves, softened and stretched by time. In their philosophy, nothing moved alone. Everything drifted in relation to everything else. Lumarai was not an isolated curiosity. Their tide mapping became part of a larger forgotten network, an archipelago of subtle sciences practiced by other vanished cultures across the Dream Atlas. Some mapped fog, some mapped wind, some mapped the growth spirals of ancient reefs. Each one contributed a small, quiet insight into the world's grand breathing pattern. This island was only the beginning of that long, murmuring chain. As the light dims over the water columns, their glow softens until it resembles cooled glass. Waves settle into a quieter rhythm, and the mist folds itself gently around the cliffs once more. With a slow exhale, the island drifts back into its timeless place in the atlas, unrushed, unbothered, left to the tide's patient guidance. The shoreline fades, not as disappearance, but a soft return to stillness. And the night carries us onward as quietly as it arrived. The shoreline changes almost imperceptibly, the color of the water deepening into muted jade as soft mist sweeps across the horizon. The air feels slightly heavier here, not oppressive, but wrapped in cool vapor that clings to the skin like a memory trying to remain present. The world narrows into a quiet corridor of drifting fog, and through this muted veil, faint silhouettes of tall stone structures begin to form. They resemble pillars at first, then towers, and then, as the mist thins, it becomes clear they are neither towers nor pillars, just natural formations shaped by centuries of wind and slow-moving salt currents, rising like ancient guardians around the island. The land beneath the fog is unusual. Rather than sand or rock, the ground is covered in soft, porous stone resembling pumice, pale gray and almost feather-light to the touch. Every step taken on it produces no sound, as if the surface absorbs every vibration. This quiet ground extends all the way to the inner cliffs, giving the entire island an uncanny sense of stillness. Even the waves seem dampened here, crushed gently into whispers before they reach the shore. Nothing moves abruptly. The air flows in long, careful strokes, and even the trees, thin, tall, covered in dew-soaked silver leaves, sway with restrained patience. This was the home of the people later known by travelers as the Mist Weavers. They did not call themselves that. Their own name is lost, carried off by the drifting fog, but the essence of their lives remains preserved in the island's atmosphere. They were a quiet civilization that understood the properties of vapor and condensation in ways that blur the line between art and physical science. Their existence was shaped by studying the mist that endlessly enveloped their home, mist that was not random but governed by unique geological patterns beneath the island. Their dwellings were built partly underground, partly exposed to the open air. Smooth circular openings led into larger chambers carved inside the porous stone. These spaces remained naturally insulated, always cool, always quiet, always steady. Within those chambers, the mist weavers observed the movement of fog strands drifting in and out of thin slits carved into the walls. The openings were positioned so precisely that the fog flowed through them like weaving threads, creating patterns of density and motion that changed throughout the day. To them, the shifting fog was a map, not of geography, but of time and subtle motion. Instead of tracking stars or seasons, they tracked condensation points and air densities. To modern atmospheric science, this relates to microclimate mapping, the study of small, hyperlocal weather systems created by narrow environmental variables. The mist weavers lived in such a system, and over centuries they learned its language. Their dwellings were built partly underground, partly exposed to the open air. Smooth circular openings led into larger chambers carved inside the porous stone. These spaces remained naturally insulated, always cool, always quiet, always steady. Within those chambers, the mist weavers observed the movement of fog strands drifting in and out of thin slits carved into the walls. The openings were positioned so precisely that the fog flowed through them like weaving threads, creating patterns of density and motion that changed throughout the day. To them, the shifting fog was a map, not of geography, but of time and subtle motion. Instead of tracking stars or seasons, they tracked condensation points and air densities. To modern atmospheric science, this relates to microclimate mapping, the study of small, hyperlocal weather systems created by narrow environmental variables. The mist weavers lived inside such a system, and over centuries they learned its language. Their dwellings were built partly underground, partly exposed to the open air. Smooth circular openings led into larger chambers carved inside the porous stone. These spaces remained naturally insulated, always cool, always quiet, always steady. Within those chambers, the mist weavers observed the movement of fog strands drifting in and out of thin slits carved into the walls. The openings were positioned so precisely that the fog flowed through them like weaving threads, creating patterns of density and motion that changed throughout the day. To them, the shifting fog was a map, not of geography, but of time and subtle motion. Instead of tracking stars or seasons, they tracked condensation points and air densities. To modern atmospheric science, this relates to microclimate mapping, the study of small, hyperlocal weather systems created by narrow environmental variables. The mist weavers lived inside such a system, and over centuries they learned its language. Their main practice revolved around fog spirals, slow rotating currents of vapor that formed naturally between the two tallest stone formations on the island. These spirals were not violent whirlwinds, but gentle coils of mist rising upward in elegant curves. By watching these spirals and marking their changes, the mist weavers detected patterns in the island's deeper structure. Some spirals rose high and thin, indicating shifts in underground geothermal activity. Others widened at the base, signaling humidity changes predicted hours before rainfall. The slightest deviations in rotation speed told them about distant pressure shifts over the open ocean. They carved thin vertical pillars of stone around the spiral sites to capture droplets of dew. The droplets behaved differently depending on the spiral's motion. Sometimes they collected in straight lines, other times in angled curves, and occasionally they formed branching networks resembling frost patterns. Each droplet shape was a data point. Without writing, without instruments, they created long-term observational records using only their eyes, stillness, and memory. Their understanding was a quiet science shaped not by calculation, but by immersion. Modern meteorologists would recognize the principles they studied: microcyclonic rotation, humidity gradient layers, dew point transitions, and temperature inversions. These are foundational aspects of weather formation, yet the mist weavers approached them with such calm precision that their observations mirrored what modern sensors detect. Their fog spirals likely formed due to the island's unique topography, two tall formations creating a pressure corridor where cool and warm air met. This produced stable rotational currents, rare but scientifically plausible. Inside their underground chambers, long channels carved into the stone guided thin streams of fog into controlled spaces. The inhabitants watched how the vapor moved, how it thickened, how it thinned. Subtle shifts indicated changes in air composition or heat flux deep underground. In a sense, they practiced early atmospheric diagnostics, reading invisible forces through visible signs. For them, watching the fog was not study in the academic sense, it was participation in a slow, breathing dialogue with the environment. Within their philosophy, mist symbolized transition. It was the boundary between states, water becoming air, clarity becoming obscurity, heat becoming coolness. They viewed life itself as a gradual movement between forms, always softening, always blending, always shifting. Their rituals reflected this belief. When they honored their ancestors, they did not carve monuments. They created small fog pools, shallow basins of cold stone where condensation collected naturally. As the fog passed over the water, it formed delicate patterns on the surface, shapes that lasted seconds before dissolving. The mist weaver saw this as the essence of existence, beautiful, fleeting, and constantly renewing. The scientific resonance of their worldview lies in the transient nature of atmospheric systems. Fog is not stable. It forms under narrow conditions and dissolves at the slightest temperature change. Atmospheric scientists today study fog formation to understand complex interactions between ground temperature, radiation cooling, and moisture saturation. The mist weavers mastered this without equations, relying on slow observation and an almost meditative patience. The island connects to a broader understanding of the archipelago's forgotten sciences. If Lumarai listened to the tides, then this island listened to the air. Where the tide keepers mapped rhythm, the mist weavers mapped transition. Both civilizations contributed to a larger quiet knowledge system that saw the world not as a series of separate phenomena, but as interconnected cycles of motion, breath, and transformation. Fog, tide, wind, and stone, each was a different expression of the same underlying harmony. As the day lengthens, the mist thickens again, drawn back into the island's center like a slow inhale. The fog spirals blur until their edges soften, and the tall formations become silhouettes once more. The porous ground absorbs the sound of receding air, and everything returns to its original stillness. The island folds itself back into quiet vapor, leaving only the soft impression of its presence lingering like the last trace of breath on a cold window. The shallow water brightens slowly, as if the sea itself remembers something from long ago and reveals it only in gentle increments. Light bends through the surface in wavering columns, soft enough to calm the mind, steady enough to illuminate the reefs below. The water here is unusually clear, the kind of clarity that seems not to belong to the physical world, but to a memory that drifts quietly beneath consciousness. Shapes move beneath. Not fast, not urgent, simply living, growing, layering themselves over centuries in patterns too slow for the human eye, but perfect for the patient mind of the ocean. Below the surface lies the world of the Velouthian reefs, a labyrinth of living structures grown instead of built. The coral branches form intricate corridors, long passages that twist gently like the inside of a shell. Blues shift into soft greens, and pale gold threads appear within the deeper channels where light filters in at a lower angle. It is not a single reef, but a network, large enough to be mistaken for a submerged city by anyone who does not understand the language of the sea. The water moves like breath between the coral walls, slow, rhythmic, peaceful. The people who once lived on the nearby islands understood these structures not as scenery, but as a form of quiet intelligence. They were known as the reef scholars, a community who considered coral a companion rather than a material. Their homes were simple, placed far enough from the water that storms would not harm them, but close enough that the changing reef tides were always within view. From a young age, children learned to drift along the shallow channels, holding on to smooth stones to steady their movement, because they believed coral grew best where human stillness encouraged it. Their days were shaped by tides rather than hours. When low tide came, they walked along the exposed outer edges, leaving soft marks that would wash away by morning. During high tide, they drifted within the warm channels, observing how the coral tips brightened or dimmed depending on small changes in water temperature. They created no written scrolls, no carved tablets. Knowledge was instead carried in the patterns they recognized, growth directions, color shifts, structural repetitions, and subtle symmetries that unfolded year after year. The reef scholars believed memory existed everywhere, not only in living minds, but in anything shaped by time. They saw coral not simply as an organism, but as a slow chronicle of the sea. Every growth line captured a season. Every forked branch stored the story of a storm. Every change in hue reflected a change in salinity or warmth. They said the reefs whispered, not in sound, but in form. And for them, to study the reef was to study the history of their world. The phenomenon that fascinated them most was the library corridors, naturally occurring passages where coral grew in long parallel rows. These formations, rare in most parts of the world, appeared abundantly here because of the way currents moved through the underwater channels. Over centuries, water flowed in steady lines, encouraging the coral to grow in shapes that mirrored the movement. To the reef scholars, these corridors resembled shelves, each one representing a season. They swam slowly between them, fingertips trailing along edges, memorizing the texture of each growth pattern. From a scientific perspective, such formations could arise from consistent directional current speed, stable nutrient distribution, and a predictable temperature gradient. Coral is responsive to its environment. When currents are smooth, the structures tend to elongate. When water motion shifts irregularly, branches form in more chaotic clusters. The reefs in this region were shaped by one of the longest uninterrupted current flows in that oceanic zone, giving them an unusually regular form. The reef scholars did not need modern terminology to understand this. They simply recognized the pattern and learned its meaning through careful observation. Coral's biological intelligence comes not from a brain, but from responsiveness. Polyps react to light gradients, chemical signals, and microcurrents, creating forms that mirror these conditions over time. A coral labyrinth becomes, in its own way, an archive of the water's memory. Scientists today study coral rings and skeletal density to understand past climates, the same principle the reef scholars discovered intuitively. They had no laboratories, but they spent lifetimes watching the reefs breathe with the tides, learning to decode subtle shifts in structure that signaled deeper environmental change. One of the reflective practices of the reef scholars involved floating motionless near the centers of large coral chambers, where water slowed and amplified the smallest sensory signals. In these still pockets, sound softened, and even thoughts seemed to move more gently. They believed the mind drifted closer to its natural rhythm when surrounded by slow-growing forms. Coral could not hurry, and so its presence reminded humans of a pace older than memory. Observing it required patience, and patience became their philosophy. The emotional meaning of these reefs was tied to their endurance. Coral grows slowly, millimeters per year, yet with collective effort, the structures rise into towering labyrinths that outlive generations. The reef scholars saw this as a lesson in quiet perseverance. Small actions, repeated through time, become architecture. Even storms, which sometimes broke sections of the reefs, were understood as part of the rhythm. Destruction made space for new growth, and new growth eventually filled the gaps. Nothing was lost, it simply changed form. At times, the scholars noticed color changes across large sections of the reef. Pale shifts signaled warming, darker tones indicated cool currents. They used these patterns to understand seasonal transitions and to predict when storms might arrive. In modern science, similar observations help researchers identify bleaching events or nutrient depletion. The reef scholars interpreted these signs softly, as messages rather than warnings, believing the sea offered guidance for those who listened with patience. As years passed, the civilization became deeply intertwined with the reef cycles. Their ceremonies were held at low tide in tide pools shaped like natural amphitheaters. Their elders taught knowledge not by instruction, but by drifting through coral corridors with younger members, pointing quietly at formations that held meaning. Their stories were not spoken in linear chronology. They were experienced as paths through the reef. Every turn represented a lesson. Every branch represented a choice. The world around them shifted slowly, and so did they. They believed understanding came from immersion rather than explanation, from letting the sea show its patterns rather than seeking to impose meaning. They lived with the awareness that their own memories, like coral, could grow outward in gentle spirals shaped by the quiet currents of daily experience. When the tide pulled away from the reef near dusk, the labyrinth revealed new shapes. Pools formed mirrors, reflecting the sky in fragments broken only by ripples. The scholars called this the reading hour, when the reef's long shadows stretched across the seabed. In these moments, they said the coral shared its oldest stories, the ones carried through centuries of storms and seasons. The light dims gradually, and the reef settles into a deeper calm. Water moves softly through the channels, continuing the slow growth that will shape its future. The corridors remain, patient and unhurried, storing the quiet memory of the sea for whoever chooses to drift through them next. The quiet patterns of the Ashalu sand mosaic keepers become clearer the longer you observe the way their world moved, slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had softened around their dunes. Their homes were shaped from pressed desert quartz, stacked in rounded layers, each wall etched with flowing spiral designs meant to resemble the wind's memory. The wind was not just a natural force to them, it was a keeper of stories. They believed every grain of sand held a fragment of something once spoken, once lived, once forgotten. So their work was not simply about crafting mosaics. It was about arranging memories, piece by piece, into forms that carried meaning across generations. Travelers who crossed their territory described the landscape as strangely peaceful. Even when the noon sun burned fiercely, there was a sense of calm in the way the dunes rose and fell like giant sleeping forms. The Ashalu walked slowly across these hills, never hurried, because their belief taught them that rushing disturbed the natural rhythm of sand. They trained their footsteps to be gentle, leaving patterns behind them like temporary calligraphy. When a strong wind came, the patterns vanished, but the Ashalu did not see that as a loss. They saw it as completion. Nothing, in their worldview, was meant to remain unchanged. Their mosaics displayed the same philosophy. Each one began with a long moment of stillness. The artisans sat before an empty sandbed, eyes half closed, listening to the sound of the surrounding desert. They would wait until the mind settled into a soft quiet, something between concentration and dreaming. Then, using curved tools carved from bone or polished wood, they shaped thin channels into the ground. The channels guided the colored sands, iron red, pale gold, volcanic black, copper green, poured with steady breaths. It was said that if an artisan's breath faltered even briefly, the sand flow would record that tremor forever. But these imperfections were not corrected. The Ashalu believed flaws made the mosaic more alive. At dusk, the mosaics looked like glowing maps of forgotten constellations. Many of them represented stories from their oral traditions, tales of wandering spirits, lost oases, migrating dunes, and star paths that once guided ancestors. But some patterns did not resemble anything familiar. These were the dream mosaics, created after the artisans recorded images seen during half-sleep states. They valued these pieces deeply, treating them as windows into the subconscious of the desert itself. Observers described them as hypnotic, spirals flowing into fractal shapes, dreamlike currents folding into one another, much like ripples in a calm sea frozen in place. Nighttime in Ashalu settlements carried a unique atmosphere. Gentle lanterns made of hollowed gourds and thin sheets of mica cast warm circles of light. The air grew cooler, and the desert floor released the heat it had stored. Community gatherings formed around central mosaic plazas where elders spoke slowly, letting their voices sink into the sand so that, in their belief, the ground could hold the story. Children often fell asleep during these recitations, curled on mats woven from date fibers. Adults listened with steady breaths, believing that patience itself was an offering to the wind. What made this civilization particularly fascinating was their perception of time. They believed the past was not behind, but beneath. The entire desert was a layered archive. Every storm revealed and concealed different chapters. This belief shaped their architecture. Houses were built in shallow depressions rather than on raised ground. The Ashalu said that living slightly below the sand surface kept them closer to ancestral memory. Visitors found the interiors surprisingly cool and quiet, shielded from desert winds by sloping entry tunnels. Walls were decorated with suspended jars filled with colored sand bands. These jars served as calendars. Whenever a major wind season arrived, some sand layers shifted subtly, marking the passage of cycles. Their scientific understanding of the desert was quietly sophisticated. They predicted sandstorm routes with notable accuracy by reading micropatterns in dune edges, the scent of the air, and the texture of the morning wind. Traders spoke of an Ashalu talent for identifying distant moisture. A slight weight change in the breeze or a faint cool layer near sunrise told them when hidden aquifers or temporary springs were about to rise. This sensitivity was not mystical, it was developed through generations of observation. Their survival depended on reading the desert like a living document. Of all their traditions, the most intriguing was the night of dissolving patterns. Once a year, every mosaic in the settlement, some that took months to create, was erased intentionally. Artisans gathered at dawn, using wide brushes of woven reed to sweep away their own masterpieces. Outsiders found the ritual heartbreaking, but the Ashalu saw it as renewal. They taught that attachment hardened the spirit. By letting beauty return to the dunes, one made space for new stories to form. After the final mosaic disappeared, the entire community shared a meal of spiced grains and desert herbs, sitting quietly as the sun climbed. It was one of the few festivals where silence replaced singing. Their disappearance remains one of the desert's enduring mysteries. No evidence of conflict, famine, or disease has been found. Archaeologists discovered remnants of mosaic pits, pieces of mica lanterns, and jars with traces of colored sand, but nothing indicating violence. The leading theory suggests a gradual migration driven by shifting trade routes or long-term drought. Yet some believe they simply followed their own philosophy, moving with the wind when the desert signaled a change. If the wind whispered that memory was shifting elsewhere, the Ashalu would not resist. They would walk softly into a new landscape, leaving almost no trace behind. The most poetic interpretations come from desert nomads who inherited fragments of Ashalu stories. These accounts describe a final mosaic, larger than any before it, depicting a vast spiral that symbolized return. According to legend, after this artwork was completed, a rare, gentle storm swept through and lifted the entire mosaic into the air, scattering the colored sands across the dunes. For the Ashalu, this would have been seen not as destruction, but as a sign that their work had become part of the desert's memory. Whether this event is literal or symbolic remains unknown, but it captures the essence of their worldview. Nothing ended, nothing vanished, everything simply changed shape. What remains today are subtle traces, patterns faintly visible in protected hollows, shards of decorated quartz walls half buried in drifting sands, and stories that still echo among nomads who pause to listen to the desert's quiet murmurs. The Ashalu may be gone, but the philosophy woven through their patterns continues to soften the imagination of anyone who studies them. Their legacy is not stone or metal, but the gentle idea that a world can be understood through patience, attention, and reverence for fleeting beauty. Their sand mosaics might have dissolved, yet the calm they carried continues to drift through time like the wind that once shaped their lives. The quiet world of the Merilith tide scribes unfolded along a coastline where the sea itself seemed to move with deliberate slowness. This civilization lived on a series of long, pale shelves of limestone that jutted into the water, like the pages of an ancient book. Over thousands of years, waves carved smooth grooves and channels into the rock, and the Meriliths believed these markings were natural writing left by the ocean. To them, every shift of water, every ripple along the shore carried a message. They thought the sea spoke in patterns, and their lives were dedicated to learning how to read its shifting script. Each morning began with the same ritual. As the tide receded, scribes walked down to the exposed rocks, their feet leaving soft impressions on the damp surface. They observed the fresh channels left by the night waves, studying the angles and depth of each line. Some channels were thin and sinuous, some wide and blunt, and they recorded these variations carefully. The scribes carried thin slate tablets coated with chalk dust, using shell-tipped styluses to trace the shapes of new water-carved symbols. Over generations, these tablets formed a vast archive of wave patterns, layer upon layer of quiet observation. The Meriliths believed that the sea held memory, and that its movements encoded stories from distant places. They saw the ocean not as a barrier, but as a flowing consciousness touching all shores at once. When storms arrived from the open water, the scribes gathered to study the violent new lines gouged into the stone. They interpreted these as warnings or distant echoes of events across the ocean, perhaps a volcanic eruption or the collapse of a far-off cliffside. Their interpretations were rarely literal. They understood the sea as metaphor. A sharp zigzag might represent conflict. A deep sweeping curve might symbolize renewal. Through such readings, they shaped a philosophy built on fluidity and acceptance. Their settlements were carved directly into the limestone shelves. Homes had rounded entrances resembling sea caves, softened by centuries of wind-polished stone. Inside, the walls were decorated with pigments made from crushed shells and chalk, forming looping designs that imitated wave crests. The sound of the ocean was constant, echoing through the corridors in a steady, rhythmic pulse that lulled inhabitants into a calm state. At night, the tide filled some of these carved channels partially, producing gentle notes like distant flutes. The Meriliths believed the sea was singing to them, and they answered by maintaining the carvings with care, smoothing rough edges so the tide could produce the intended tones. Their understanding of currents was unusually advanced. Long before other coastal cultures developed similar knowledge, the Meriliths tracked water temperature, direction, and salinity indirectly through the marks left on the limestone. They noted how different currents produced different erosional patterns. Cool currents created sharp, narrow cuts. Warm currents produced broader curves. During certain seasons, when plankton blooms tinted the water a faint green, the residue left behind formed a thin film on the rocks, providing additional data. Over centuries, this continuous observation allowed them to predict seasonal changes with impressive accuracy. Their language reflected their environment. Many of their words had flowing forms, made up of long phonetic transitions without abrupt stops. Conversations were slow and measured, drifting from one idea to the next like a wave rolling along shore. Silence was not considered empty. It was part of communication. A pause allowed the listener to absorb meaning the same as the scribes studied patterns left by the tide. Outsiders who later encountered remnants of their inscriptions found the writing system to be equally fluid, composed of long curves and nested spirals representing different wave cycles. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Merilith culture was their practice of tidal forecasting sculptures. These were low, bowl-shaped carvings made in areas where the water advanced and receded predictably. By studying how water filled these stone basins, how long it lingered, and the patterns of evaporation or foam deposits, they predicted distant storms well before they arrived. Modern researchers speculate that these carvings acted like primitive hydrological instruments, recording subtle changes in wave resonance. Their belief system centered around an entity referred to as the long tide. This was not a deity in a traditional sense, but a concept representing the gradual, ancient flow that shaped all things. They believed the long tide connected past, present, and future, moving slowly across the world. To honor this concept, they created memory channels, long lines carved into limestone that aligned with rising tides during certain lunar phases. When the water filled these channels, it reflected moonlight in shimmering trails. The Meriliths considered this a moment when the long tide became visible. Meals were simple and reflective of their environment. They consumed sea plants, small shellfish, and fish dried in patterns that resembled rolling waves. Even food preparation followed a ceremonial rhythm. No one rushed. Every task flowed gently into the next. Their philosophy encouraged slow, intentional living, mirroring the patient shaping of stone by water. Their decline was not abrupt. It occurred gradually as tectonic shifts altered the coastline. Over several generations, parts of their limestone shelves collapsed into the sea, taking homes, memory channels, and tidal inscriptions with them. Instead of resisting, the Meroliths accepted the changes. Their worldview taught that nothing was permanent, and the sea eventually reclaimed everything it touched. They migrated inland but did not adapt well to environments without the constant presence of tidal rhythms. Their inscriptions stopped appearing. Their carving tools were left behind, and eventually the civilization dissolved into surrounding cultures. All that remains today are scattered carved basins filled with rainwater, fragments of curved inscriptions on fallen limestone blocks, and stories from coastal nomads who speak of people who once read the sea like a living journal. To archaeologists, the Meroliths represent one of the most peaceful societies ever found, quiet observers of a world in motion. Their legacy is a reminder of how intimately humans can learn from nature when patience becomes a way of life. The sea writes slowly, they believed, and to understand it, one must slow down as well. Even now, when the tide recedes along certain ancient coasts, faint markings appear on the stone, lines that look too deliberate, too patterned to be random. Some researchers believe these are the remnants of Merolith inscriptions, softened by centuries of waves. Others think the patterns are natural. But anyone who has studied their world understands that the boundary between nature and meaning in this civilization never existed. Everything was a message, and every message was meant to calm the observer, guiding them gently into awareness of the slow rhythm that shapes all shores. The island stood within a ring of fog that never fully lifted, creating a world where shapes softened as soon as they appeared. This place was home to the Valian Mistweavers, a civilization that understood the behavior of fog with a precision that felt impossible for their era. Their villages rested on terraces carved into gentle slopes, each level draped in moisture so fine it shimmered like powdered glass. The air was cool, always carrying the faint scent of wet stone. For the Mistweavers, fog was not an inconvenience, but a language, subtle, fleeting, and alive. They watched how fog pooled in valleys, curled around cliffs, and drifted through narrow mountain passes. Every shift had meaning. They studied how temperature changes produced layers of mist that stacked like soft blankets above the ground. Their homes were designed to guide fog, with curved openings that collected moisture and smooth channels that directed it toward reservoirs. Even their pathways followed the natural flow of condensation, gently sloping to ensure a perfect drip rhythm. The island's ecosystem was shaped by this careful partnership between human intention and the sky's quiet breath. The civilization developed instruments that resembled hollow reeds, stone rings, and delicate mesh frameworks made from plant fibers. These tools captured variations in humidity and airflow. When the wind passed through the reeds, they produced faint tones, some deep and low, others thin and whisper-like. The Mistweavers interpreted these tones as indicators of atmospheric density. Over time, they built an understanding of weather patterns by listening rather than observing. Villagers often sat for hours near these devices, absorbing the tonal shifts until the patterns became second nature. Their knowledge extended into a structure they called the Veil Codex, an oral and visual tradition passed from one generation to another. It described 4 major types of mist: the dawn veil, which formed at sunrise, the still veil, which appeared during calm midnights, the spiral veil, formed by rolling winds, and the deep veil, a rare, dense fog that settled after heavy rainfall. Each type had subcategories based on movement speed, opacity, and emotional resonance, an idea suggesting that fog changed the way thoughts traveled. To them, a drifting mist influenced memory, while a still mist encouraged reflection. Daily life moved at the same pace as the weather. Food was gathered slowly, with people taking time to examine the moisture content of leaves and fruits. The mist weavers believed plants absorbed different characteristics depending on the type of fog surrounding them during growth. Meals were simple: steamed roots, soft berries, and herbal broths infused with moisture collected from early morning fog. The flavor profiles were delicate and calming, shaped by the island's humidity cycles. Their most fascinating practice involved fog sculpting, a technique that relied on strategically placed stone structures. The mist weavers built tall, curved pillars that funneled air upward, compressing mist into spirals. As the compressed fog moved, it formed temporary shapes that floated above ceremonial platforms. Observers claimed these shapes resembled flowing ribbons or drifting petals. Scientists today propose that these sculptures manipulated microcurrents, shaping fog similarly to how aerodynamics shapes air passing around wings. The spiritual framework of this society revolved around a concept they called the quiet ascending. It described the movement of mist from low to high places as a metaphor for the journey of thought rising from confusion to clarity. When someone sought guidance, they climbed to a terrace where fog thinned enough to create shifting layers in the air. Watching these layers lift and disperse helped individuals reflect without urgency. Their meditation rituals had no chanting, no fixed posture, only stillness and a slow awareness of moisture gathering along the skin. Atmospheric science finds remarkable parallels with their practices. Fog formation depends on dew point, heat transfer, and local topography. The mist weavers learned through observation alone how ridges, valleys, and stone surfaces shaped fog behavior. In modern terms, they understood how condensation nuclei clung to certain leaves first, how rising warm air created pockets of clear space, and how humidity gradients could be predicted by watching the way mist thickened around specific rock layers. Without instruments, they mastered concepts similar to boundary layer meteorology. The island's ecosystems responded to their careful stewardship. Certain plants evolved leaves angled to maximize moisture capture. Mosses grew in rich blankets where carved channels guided condensation. Small animals that thrived in damp environment found shelter in the terraces. Researchers believe the mist weavers unintentionally created a microclimate through centuries of fog guidance. By shaping airflow pathways, they increased moisture retention and encouraged cloud forests to expand across the higher slopes. Their decline came not from conflict, but from a climatic shift that altered wind patterns across the region. The gentle spirals of mist that once formed daily were replaced by sudden dry currents that scattered fog before it condensed. The mist weavers adapted for a time, building new instruments and reshaping terraces, but the fog no longer returned in its previous abundance. Without the atmospheric rhythms they depended on, their cultural identity slowly dissolved. Many migrated, carrying fragments of the Veil Codex with them, though the teachings became symbolic rather than practical. Modern climatologists studying the island found remnants of fog sculpting pillars and terraces with precise gradients. Examination revealed an advanced understanding of stone placement to maximize condensation, a precursor to modern fog harvesting mesh used in arid regions. The island itself still receives fog, but not with the frequency described in ancient records. What remains are soft traces of pathways, eroded platforms, and hollow reed instruments that produce faint tones when touched by wind. In the early morning, when fog occasionally brushes the terraces, observers report an unusual stillness. The air thickens just enough to coat surfaces with dew. It is easy to imagine the mist weavers walking silently through the haze, reading shapes as though deciphering a living manuscript. Their world was not built on solid boundaries, but on gradients, transitions, and gentle dissolving edges. Every shift in the air carried significance. Every droplet held memory. Their legacy reminds us that the atmosphere is not empty. It is a medium full of quiet messages. Fog becomes a sculptor of thought, Moisture becomes a slow-moving recorder of change, and air becomes a teacher of patience. In empty places where clouds descend until they touch the earth, something of the mist weavers lingers. It lives in the soft weight of dawn mist and the sense that the world speaks most clearly when it whispers. A thin breath of wind moves across the sky, carrying with it the faint tremor of distant storms. Along the quiet edge of the island, the air feels unusually light, almost hollow, as if waiting for something to pass through it. High above, the clouds drift in layered sheets, crossing one another in slow, deliberate motion. Their shapes are long, stretched thin like the pages of a forgotten diary, holding marks of weather, memory, and stories that have slipped beyond human recall. This island sits beneath a corridor of ever-changing wind channels, a place where the atmosphere bends, curls, and reshapes itself so frequently that the land below has adapted to listening rather than watching. It is here that the Ravan people once lived, a gentle society attuned not to earth or sea, but to the restless sky. The structures they built still hide among the tall grasses. Light wooden frames, barely heavier than woven baskets, shaped in curved spines that mimic the natural sweep of clouds. Every part of their environment encouraged softness. The terrain rolls like slow waves of land, covered in short silver-blue vegetation that bends easily without breaking. At dawn, thin fog collects around the low areas, rising in vertical threads that move with almost rhythmic timing, revealing the first clue as to how the Ravan lived their lives. They studied the atmosphere with the devotion other cultures gave to stars, tides, or stone carvings. Theirs was a world where sound carried strangely far, stretching across valleys without losing clarity, allowing messages, songs, and warnings to travel between distant households long before the speaker came into sight. The Ravan culture formed around a single belief, that the sky could speak. They did not imagine voices or divine figures in the clouds. Instead, they believed the atmosphere produced patterns, repeating forms, layers, tones, and rhythms that reflected the deeper mood of nature. Children were taught from an early age to recognize the shift in air pressure by feeling how the wind pressed against their skin. They learned to differentiate between light winds that predicted safe days and the long, pulling drafts that preceded storms. Their social gatherings often took place on elevated ridges where they could watch cloud boundaries overlap, a natural display they considered essential for understanding the future. Much of their time was spent building complex yet delicate tools intended to interact with the wind. Narrow flute-like instruments made from driftwood, and thin fabric kites designed to vibrate or hum depending on incoming weather systems. Along these ridges, the Ravan installed rows of wind flutes, hollow instruments carved into wooden branches and arranged in carefully measured intervals. When the air moved through them, they produced sounds that varied in pitch and resonance. Some tones signaled rainfall approaching from the south. Deeper vibrations hinted at cold fronts pressing from the open ocean. Sharp, almost metallic notes warned of high-altitude turbulence that might tear apart clouds and scatter storms in unpredictable directions. To a visitor unfamiliar with the island, the sounds may have seemed random or eerie. But to the Ravan, this was communication. They believed the sky was never silent. Humans merely lacked the tools to hear it clearly. Modern atmospheric science echoes aspects of their understanding. Shifts in air density, moisture, and pressure genuinely affect how sound travels. Low-frequency vibrations often precede thunderstorms. Certain cloud formations, especially lenticular and altostratus layers, can foreshadow strong channel winds. Atmospheric physicists study these signs, but the Ravan lived inside them, treating the sky like a grand moving library of information. The flutes they built acted similarly to what we now call acoustic sensors. Primitive, yes, but astonishing in their intuitive accuracy. They detected subtle conditions long before they were visible at ground level. Kites, too, played a central role in their observations. Unlike modern kites made for recreation, Ravon kites were instruments. They built them with layered fabrics that responded differently to air pressure. When lifted into the sky, the tension along their cords transmitted information back to the person holding them. A sharply vibrating cord indicated rising warm air. A sluggish pull suggested heavy moisture accumulation. Thin reed housings attached to the kites created soft buzzing tones that changed depending on incoming weather systems. Along these ridges, the Ravon installed rows of wind flutes, hollow instruments carved into wooden branches and arranged in carefully measured intervals. When the air moved through them, they produced sounds that varied in pitch and resonance. Some tones signaled rainfall approaching from the south. Deeper vibrations hinted at cold fronts pressing from the open ocean. Sharp, almost metallic notes warned of high-altitude turbulence that might tear apart clouds and scatter storms in unpredictable directions. To a visitor unfamiliar with the island, the sounds may have seemed random or eerie. But to the Ravon, this was communication. They believed the sky was never silent. Humans merely lacked the tools to hear it clearly. Modern atmospheric science echoes aspects of their understanding. Shifts in air density, moisture, and pressure genuinely affect how sound travels. Low-frequency vibrations often precede thunderstorms. Certain cloud formations, especially lenticular and altostratus layers, can foreshadow strong channel winds. Atmospheric physicists study these signs, but the Ravon lived inside them, treating the sky like a grand moving library of information. The flutes they built acted similarly to what we now call acoustic sensors. Primitive, yes, but astonishing in their intuitive accuracy. They detected subtle conditions long before they were visible at ground level. Kites, too, played a central role in their observations. Unlike modern kites made for recreation, Ravon kites were instruments. They built them with layered fabrics that responded differently to air pressure. When lifted into the sky, the tension along their cords transmitted information back to the person holding them. A sharply vibrating cord indicated rising warm air. A sluggish pull suggested heavy moisture accumulation. Thin reed housings attached to the kites created soft buzzing tones that changed depending on incoming weather systems. Along these ridges, the Ravon installed rows of wind flutes, hollow instruments carved into wooden branches and arranged in carefully measured intervals. When the air moved through them, they produced sounds that varied in pitch and resonance. Some tones signaled rainfall approaching from the south. Deeper vibrations hinted at cold fronts pressing from the open ocean. Sharp, almost metallic notes warned of high-altitude turbulence that might tear apart clouds and scatter storms in unpredictable directions. To a visitor unfamiliar with the island, the sounds may have seemed random or eerie. But to the Ravon, this was communication. They believed the sky was never silent. Humans merely lacked the tools to hear it clearly. Modern atmospheric science echoes aspects of their understanding. Shifts in air density, moisture, and pressure genuinely affect how sound travels. Low-frequency vibrations often precede thunderstorms. Certain cloud formations, especially lenticular and altostratus layers, can foreshadow strong channel winds. Atmospheric physicists study these signs, but the Ravon lived inside them, treating the sky like a grand moving library of information. The flutes they built acted similarly to what we now call acoustic sensors. Primitive, yes, but astonishing in their intuitive accuracy. They detected subtle conditions long before they were visible at ground level. Kites, too, played a central role in their observations. Unlike modern kites made for recreation, Ravon kites were instruments. They built them with layered fabrics that responded differently to air pressure. When lifted into the sky, the tension along their cords transmitted information back to the person holding them. A sharply vibrating cord indicated rising warm air. A sluggish pull suggested heavy moisture accumulation. Thin reed housings attached to the kites created soft buzzing tones that changed depending on incoming weather systems. Along these ridges, the Ravan installed rows of wind flutes, hollow instruments carved into wooden branches and arranged in carefully measured intervals. When the air moved through them, they produced sounds that varied in pitch and resonance. Some tones signaled rainfall approaching from the south. Deeper vibrations hinted at cold fronts pressing from the open ocean. Sharp, almost metallic notes warned of high-altitude turbulence that might tear apart clouds and scatter storms in unpredictable directions. To a visitor unfamiliar with the island, the sounds may have seemed random or eerie. But to the Ravan, this was communication. They believed the sky was never silent. Humans merely lacked the tools to hear it clearly. Modern atmospheric science echoes aspects of their understanding. Shifts in air density, moisture, and pressure genuinely affect how sound travels. Low-frequency vibrations often precede thunderstorms. Certain cloud formations, especially lenticular and altostratus layers, can foreshadow strong channel winds. Atmospheric physicists study these signs, but the Ravan lived inside them, treating the sky like a grand moving library of information.
The islands, known as the Aurelian Sand Mirror Sanctuary, sit within a narrow crescent of reefs shaped by slow, ancient tides. Each island is made of unusually fine, almost glass-like sand. Particles so smooth they behave less like crushed rock and more like powdered crystal. When undisturbed, the surface forms natural reflective planes, catching the light of dawn and dusk in wide, soft glimmers. These reflective layers were historically mistaken for standing water, which gave the region its early name among mariners, the false lagoons. The phenomenon is caused by angular silica grains allied by constant wind patterns, creating a natural field of micromirrors that scatter light in flat, sheet-like patterns. Across the center of the main island lies a long depression known as the Corridor of Still Echoes. It is a gently curved channel where wind speeds drop dramatically. Scientists studying the area note that the channel's acoustics remove high-frequency components from sound waves, causing voices to become softer, warmer, and oddly rounded. Indigenous groups respected this place as a natural chamber of clarity. They believed the corridor offered a way to listen to one's thoughts more distinctly, free from the exaggeration of outside noise. Whispered phrases here travel farther than spoken ones elsewhere, carried by low-frequency waves that lose almost no energy over distance. The Aurelian Islands also exhibit a rare layering of temperature bands close to the ground. Because the sand is highly reflective, it absorbs less heat than typical beaches. As a result, cool pockets of air remain trapped just above the surface, forming shallow thermal layers only a few centimeters thick. Anyone walking barefoot here feels alternating warmth and coolness with every step, as if each patch of sand belongs to a different time of day. Local researchers call these thermal veils, and they contribute to the island's legendary reputation for soothing physical tension. Prolonged exposure creates a mild, relaxing sensory confusion, which might explain why ancient navigators describe the place as capable of calming emotional storms. Near the western edge of the largest island sits a cluster of smooth stone platforms. These circular formations were once believed to be ceremonial sites, but more recent analysis suggests a practical purpose. The surfaces contained consistent radial chisel marks, likely used as grinding platforms for shaping polished lenses and reflective discs. The people who lived here appear to have mastered the art of manipulating light. Evidence suggests they crafted small convex mirrors capable of focusing sunlight onto distant objects, perhaps as a method for signaling across islands or marking specific times of day based on shadow geometry. Archaeologists uncovered fragments of thin, curved glass-like plates buried beneath layers of wind-blown sand. These fragments show signs of controlled heating, suggesting the Aurelian inhabitants used early forms of solar-based kiln technology. By positioning reflective discs at precise angles, they could concentrate heat into narrow focal points. This allowed them to melt silica into small, usable shapes without the need for wood-burning furnaces. The technology was fragile and would not have produced the large structures, but it demonstrates an understanding of optics far ahead of surrounding coastal communities. One structure stands apart from the rest, the sand mirror chamber. It is a semi-subterranean room stabilized by stone ribs and packed with fine reflective sand. Narrow openings in the ceiling allowed controlled beams of sunlight to enter at specific times of day. When aligned correctly, the beams would reflect off angled surfaces inside the room, producing luminous patterns across the walls. These patterns change through the year, creating a shifting calendar of light. Instead of using carvings or standing markers, this culture tracked seasonal change through a soft, dynamic display of brightness and shadow. The chamber functioned like a patient clock, its rhythm guided by the sky. Visitors moving through this environment today experience a quiet visual complexity. Light behaves unpredictably, but always gently. The islands are famous for producing low-glow halos around objects at sunrise due to micro-reflections in the sand layers. These halos fade as the sun rises higher, giving the mornings a dreamlike character. Researchers studying these effects describe them as diffuse photic echoes, where scattered rays recombine in soft gradients that seem to float just above the dunes. Such optical behavior has been observed in only a handful of places worldwide, most of them composed of similarly fine crystalline sediments. The fauna of the Aurelian region adapted to the reflective terrain. Small nocturnal crabs leave intricate trails shaped by their avoidance of brighter patches of moonlit sand. Their paths form branching patterns resembling root systems. Biologists believe these trails serve as protection networks, allowing the crabs to stay within colder microthermal pockets where predators have difficulty detecting their heat signatures. A rare species of lizard possessing semi-transparent scales changes color based on the direction of reflected sunlight. Its camouflage is so effective that early explorers believed the island had almost no animal life at all. One of the most intriguing discoveries involves carved stone slates found in a collapsed shelter near the island's inland dunes. The slates contain deep, curved lines that appear to represent the movement of shadows throughout a day. The layering of curves suggests that Aurelian observers may have tracked multiple light paths simultaneously, including those produced by secondary reflections off sand surfaces. This indicates an observational discipline focused not just on the sun itself, but on the behavior of light in their environment. The precision suggests a culture that valued subtlety, patience, and an intimate understanding of the shifting conditions around them. There are signs that the Aurelian people practiced a form of meditative alignment using the environment's natural optical effects. Flat areas near the dunes show evenly spaced depressions arranged in arcs, as if individuals sat or knelt in coordinated formations. Direct sunlight reflected from the sand into these positions would have created a gentle, rhythmic flickering, akin to soft, natural visual pulses. These effects can induce relaxation, similar to the calming sensation produced by watching sunlight play across water. The decline of the Aurelian society remains a quiet mystery. Some evidence suggests increasing storm activity reshaped the islands, burying structures under migrating sand sheets. Changing wind patterns may have disrupted the carefully maintained reflective fields, removing the foundation of their optical-based practices. Their disappearance was gradual, leaving behind no signs of conflict. Only shifting sand, silent chambers, and scattered fragments of engineered light remain. Today, walking through what is left of the Sand Mirror Sanctuary feels like moving through a memory. The dunes shimmer softly, the air folds light into gentle gradients. Shadows drift across the ground like slow-moving thoughts. Everything feels unhurried, meant to ease the senses into quiet reflection. It is a place where brightness never feels harsh, and silence carries the history of people who once shaped the sun's rays into their daily rituals. The Aurelian Islands stand not as ruins, but as preserved calm. They are evidence of a civilization that chose clarity and softness over walls or monuments, leaving behind a landscape where light behaves like an old, lingering companion.
The Veluvian archipelago lies at the edge of a volcanic seamount chain where underwater lava fields cool rapidly under strong circular ocean currents. This process leaves behind extensive obsidian formations, smooth black glass shaped by both heat and water. Early navigators described the islands as dark mirrors rising from a shifting sea. The Veluvian inhabitants built their society around these reflective surfaces, incorporating obsidian into tools, ritual objects, and even components of their marine shelters. The islands gained a reputation for being able to hold shadows, a reference to the way light moved across their glossy structures at different times of day. Surrounding the main island, underwater channels funnel warm and cold currents into spiraling patterns. These currents create a rhythmic flow that repeats every 9 days, forming natural corridors ideal for travel. The Veluvian people understood these oceanic cycles with remarkable precision, using the current shifts as both a transportation system and a timekeeping method. Observations carved into stone tablets, preserved in protected rock alcoves, indicate a cycle tracking tradition based on water temperature, current direction, and the color changes visible in suspended mineral particles. The people read the sea the way others might observe stars. Many of the Veluvian structures incorporate pillars of obsidian set into volcanic tuff. These pillars are positioned at angles that catch sunlight briefly during specific tidal moments. When the tide reaches its highest point, light flashes across the obsidian in quick, sharp streaks. These flashes are visible even from several kilometers offshore. It is believed that these luminous markers served as navigational beacons to guide returning fishing vessels through the reefs. Because obsidian is rich in iron and magnesium, the polished surfaces respond strongly to sunlight, producing intense but momentary gleams. Some researchers theorize that the Veluvians may have organized community schedules around these light events, aligning daily tasks with the ocean's pulse. Fragments of ritual objects found in shoreline caves contained thin slices of obsidian shaped into delicate crescents. Microscopic examination shows that the edges were sharpened uniformly, but their purpose was not utilitarian. Instead of being tools, these crescents appear to align with specific shadow arcs cast by midday sun on the island's central basalt plateau. When placed vertically in shallow sand, the crescents generated precise overlapping shadows. These patterns resembled flowing currents, suggesting that the Veluvians may have developed a symbolic system linking light, shadow, and water cycles. The island's culture displayed a deep fascination with patterns that changed rhythmically but returned predictably. The Veluvians engineered their coastal dwellings with unusual architectural principles. Instead of building elevated huts, they created semi-submerged shelters designed to interact with rising tides. Stone floors were laid below average tide level so that water would gently fill the lower chambers during high tide. These spaces functioned as natural cooling rooms. As ocean water seeped through the channels and receded, it regulated interior temperature and humidity. The constant washing of walls with salt water also preserved the stone surfaces and reduced buildup of organic growth. Archaeologists studying the remaining foundations note that the Veluvians must have understood hydrodynamics intuitively, using ocean movement not as an obstacle but as part of their living environment. In deeper sections of the archipelago, divers have discovered clusters of carved stone weights once used to anchor floating platforms made from tightly bundled reed rafts. These platforms served as resting points along the main current corridors. With their help, long-distance travel between islands became a slow, steady drift instead of strenuous paddling. Some weights contain engraved markings believed to indicate the direction of dominant currents at different times of the cycle. Although these symbols remain undeciphered, their alignment suggests a map based on movement rather than fixed positions. The Veluvians appear to have conceptualized space as fluid, shaped by water's rhythm rather than static location. Across the surface of the main island, smooth obsidian slabs lie half buried in ash. When rain falls, a thin sheet of water forms atop the slabs and creates perfect mirror reflections. These temporary mirrors were likely used for sky observation. Oral accounts from neighboring cultures describe the Veluvians as people who watched the sky through water. It is possible they observed cloud movement, lunar cycles, or even distant stars using the reflective qualities of water pooled on obsidian. The method produces a distortion-reduced reflection as the glassy surface limits wave interference. Such a technique would have helped them track seasonal changes and interpret approaching weather systems. The Veluvian people harvested marine life adapted to the volcanic terrain. One species of deep red sea snail, now extremely rare, left mineral traces used to create pigments that bonded well with obsidian. When mixed correctly, the pigment produced a vivid, almost glowing crimson used to mark tide boundaries, ceremonial paths, and the edges of communal gathering areas. Small red lines etched along the rocks still survive, their color preserved due to being sealed by layers of cooled volcanic glass. These markings function as historical records of the island's tidal fluctuations, a long-term chronicle of the sea's rhythm across generations. Within the island's inner ravines, small chambers carved into volcanic rock display narrow openings oriented toward the sea. During specific current surges, wind passing through these slits produce low-frequency tones. When several chambers resonate together, they generate a deep harmonic vibration that moves gently through the ground. Early visitors noted that the island seemed to hum. Researchers think the Veluvians used these natural resonances to signal community events, synchronize work rhythms, or induce meditative states. The tones are calming, similar to the ambient resonance inside sea caves during steady wave motion. Another significant discovery is the presence of elongated obsidian rods found in burial sites. The rods are too brittle for practical use, but their proportions match the length of the rhythmic current cycle measured in time. This suggests that the Veluvians conceptualized time not as a circle or line, but as a wave, something with crest, trough, and flow. The rods may have symbolized the constant interaction between the people and the sea. Inscriptions on some rods contain repeating spiral motifs believed to represent the 9-day current rhythm. Vegetation on the Veluvian Islands is sparse due to the volcanic substrate, but several hardy species adapted to the environment. One type of wind-reddened grass forms soft clusters in basalt cracks. The grass bends in unison when strong currents alter wind direction above the water surface. This synchronized movement creates a subtle shimmering field, especially during late afternoon. It may have served as a natural indicator of approaching current shifts, giving the Veluvians advance notice to prepare boats, adjust schedules, or secure platforms. The decline of the Veluvian civilization appears linked to a major underwater eruption that reshaped the current corridors. Sediment samples show abrupt changes in mineral composition, suggesting a sudden redirection of volcanic vents. The new currents would have disrupted the delicate timing systems that structured their society. As travel routes became unpredictable and the tidal patterns they depended on changed, the Veluvians gradually deserted the islands. Their departure left behind obsidian structures, shadow-tracking crescents, and silent chambers that still hum during the right ocean surges. Today, the archipelago remains a place where water, light, and stone interact with quiet complexity. The obsidian glints faintly under the sun. The tides fill old chambers with cool currents. The wind moves through ancient openings, carrying tones that echo memories of a culture that lived by the rhythm of shifting seas. The islands act as a soft reminder of how deeply human life can align with natural cycles when observation and patience become the guiding structure of a civilization.
The Phelenic island chain lies within a calm interior sea where water remains unusually clear throughout the year. The clarity is caused by mineral filtration from surrounding quartz-rich cliffs. As rainwater travels downward, it carries fine silica particles that settle into the shallows, forming natural sand beds that act as a filtration system. For centuries, sailors remarked that objects dropped into these waters remained visible far deeper than in typical coastal settings. This clarity shaped the foundation of the Hellenic civilization, whose people constructed an intricate tradition of underwater archiving using glass-like structures formed from locally sourced crystallized silica. The Hellenic inhabitants crafted their tide glass archives by heating purified silica sediments in open volcanic kilns. Once the material became molten, they poured it into shallow coastal depressions carved specifically to hold the cooling mixture. As tides rose and fell, cold seawater washed over the hot silica, creating internal striations resembling tree rings. These bands captured small air pockets and mineral variations that recorded environmental conditions of the day the glass was formed. The archives, therefore, became both cultural artifacts and natural environmental records. Researchers studying fragments of these structures note that the Hellenic people intentionally embedded small objects, shells, pieces of reed, pigments, and carved symbols into the molten mixture at the moment when it reached peak viscosity. Once cooled, these inclusions formed layered images within the transparent slabs. The effect is similar to amber fossils, though created deliberately rather than naturally. The slabs were placed along shallow sea terraces where sunlight refracted through the translucent surfaces. When light passed through each slab, patterns were projected onto the sandy seafloor, forming what the Hellenic people called moving memories. Some slabs were arranged in arc formations. When the tide shifted, the water level changed the angle of refraction, altering the patterns on the sand. The shifting images were interpreted as part of a cyclical narrative. Evidence indicates these projections were used to track lunar phases, storm patterns, and seasonal transitions. Unlike typical calendars, the Hellenic system visualized the movement of time through the play of light on sand. Each tide created a new version of the same image, reinforcing the belief that knowledge lives in motion, not stillness. Archaeologists found that the Hellenic people built long, narrow channels that directed water flow into the tide glass platforms. These channels ensured a consistent interaction between waves and the structures. The slow wash of water over the glass created a humming resonance when conditions were right. The tone varied with tide height and water temperature, forming a natural acoustic signal that the community used to track changing seasons. Some channels even produced multiple tones depending on water depth, functioning like a primitive but elegant tidal instrument. Within the interior of the island, the Hellenians developed workshops where they experimented with crystallized silica. They discovered that adding traces of iron, magnesium, or volcanic ash changed the color of the glass. Red pigments signaled years of strong eastern winds. Pale blue represented calm winters. Deep green indicated years of abundant seagrass growth. Each colored slab was placed in a specific location based on the climatic or ecological phenomenon it represented. Their archive was not just a record, it was a mirror of the island's environmental rhythm across decades. The Hellenians lived in gently terraced homes built along the slopes overlooking the tide glass fields. Their architecture aligned perfectly with the paths of sunrise and moonrise. When sunlight hit at certain angles, reflections from dozens of glass slabs illuminated their dwellings in soft, rippling patterns. Residents described their mornings as beginning with the light of many waters, a phrase preserved in fragments of carved tablets found near the old workshops. This diffused, shifting light may have helped regulate circadian rhythms, much like modern light therapy. Along the shoreline, small glass towers rose from the shallows. These towers were created by stacking cooled silica blocks vertically, then carving narrow windows that allowed beams of sunlight to pass through. As the tide moved, water climbed the tower bases and refracted the incoming light. At specific tide heights, the light projected narrow dancing ribbons onto the coastal cliffs. These ribbons served as both aesthetic displays and practical indicators of tide levels. Observers could read the height and speed of an incoming tide by watching the movement of these luminous bands. Inside protected lagoons, the Thelenians constructed circular pools lined with highly polished glass. These memory pools captured sky reflections so clearly that clouds and birds appeared to drift across the surface with almost perfect sharpness. Individuals gathered around these pools for meditation and observation. Because even light winds caused micro ripples, the pools became sensitive indicators of weather changes. Subtle shifts in cloud shape or wind pressure were magnified across the surface. Inscriptions found on nearby stones suggest that the pools were used to teach children how to read atmospheric patterns long before they could read written symbols. The Thelenians developed an understanding of thermal expansion through observing their glass structures. During the warmest months, some slabs expanded and produced tiny resonant cracks. These sounds were subtle, but skilled listeners could interpret them as signals of environmental change. Several excavated tools show they shaped thin rods of cooled silica to amplify these cracks, functioning much like tuning forks. The rods vibrated when placed against the expanding glass, enabling them to detect temperature shifts with surprising accuracy. This knowledge helped them predict the arrival of monsoon winds weeks in advance. Marine life played a significant role in their scientific practices. The clarity of the water allowed them to observe behaviors of seagrass, small fish, and planktonic blooms. They tracked the slow migration of bioluminescent organisms that appeared during certain months. When these organisms gathered around tide glass structures, they illuminated the slabs from below. Residents often watched as glowing currents traced patterns across the glass, producing mesmerizing nighttime landscapes. This phenomenon strengthened the Thelenian belief that the sea itself contributed to their archives, writing its own stories in drifting light. The culture emphasized quiet study rather than expansion or conquest. Carved benches made from smoothed quartz were positioned around each tide glass formation. People sat for long periods watching the changing refractions, the gentle distortions of shadow and color. Their knowledge grew not from experimentation, but from observation. Slowly evolving patterns taught them to interpret subtle signals in the environment. They treated time like a tide, something that returns, recedes, reshapes, and renews. The decline of the Thelenic civilization appears to have resulted from a slow geological shift. Over centuries, sediment carried by storms filled the filtration sands that kept the water clear. As clarity diminished, so did the effectiveness of their archives. The refracted images blurred, the vibrant underwater projections faded, and the acoustic channels lost resonance. With the core of their knowledge system dependent on water transparency, these environmental changes gradually dissolved the foundation of their way of life. They left behind the island, but their tide glass fields remain partially intact beneath layers of sand and silt. Today, divers exploring the calm bays can still find shards of translucent silica carved by ancient hands. When held against sunlight underwater, the fragments produce faint, shifting bands of color. These remnants retain their gentle beauty, capturing fleeting memories of a culture that recorded time not in words or stone walls, but in light drifting across the sea. The island stands as a quiet testament to how human understanding can merge with natural rhythms when observation becomes a form of devotion, and when knowledge is shaped by the delicate interplay between clarity, color, and tide.
Along the edges of a quiet inland sea, flat limestone shelves rise and fall with the tides like slow-breathing creatures. These shelves form a shallow coastal plateau extending far into the water, creating the impression that the land itself is drifting. The Savican people lived here, building their entire culture around the enigmatic floating stones that gave the region its distinct character. Their world was defined by gentle tides, pale sunrises, and a constant tremor of wind that skimmed the water's surface in soft, rhythmic patterns. The coastal stone was unlike typical limestone. It contained unusually high concentrations of microscopic gas pockets trapped deep within sediment layers millions of years earlier. When carefully carved and shaped, the stone became remarkably buoyant.
Savican artisans discovered this property through generations of observation, gradually learning how to shape blocks so they floated not on the surface like wood, but just below it. These stones hovered underwater at a fixed depth, creating a sensation of suspended mass. To an outside observer, they appeared to defy their own weight, poised in a quiet balance between sinking and rising. The Savican developed an entire architectural system around these hovering stones. Their rafts were not boats, but underwater platforms shaped over months of patient carving. They positioned these rafts beneath wooden decks or woven reed structures. The effect was a floating foundation held steady by buoyant stone rather than inflated materials or hollow vessels. With careful distribution of weight, they created stable walkways, meeting spaces, and ceremonial platforms that remained level even during shifting tides. The sensation of standing on them was described as walking on anchored clouds. The stone rafts allowed the Savica to build settlements just offshore. Their homes were tethered to the coastal bedrock with braided fiber ropes made from tough marsh plants. These tethers permitted gentle movement while preventing the structures from drifting with the tide. Because the homes were slightly submerged, the interiors remained cool even during the hottest days. Mornings were filled with the soft gurgle of water against the foundations and the slow sway of the floating stone below. Residents adjusted quickly to this constant motion, describing it as a natural rhythm that eased anxious thoughts. The unique floating stone came from a geological process involving ancient reefs and long periods of compression. The microscopic pockets within the stone were irregular but widespread, giving it an appearance similar to pumice but with greater density. Standard pumice floats on the surface because it is filled with air. The Savican stone behaved differently because each pocket was isolated by mineral growth, trapping gases under pressure. These pockets limited the stone's ability to fully sink, but prevented it from rising completely. This natural equilibrium allowed the Savican to create platforms that hovered just beneath the water, something rare and not easily replicated using other materials. The Savican people believed the stone's behavior reflected a philosophy of balance central to their culture. They interpreted buoyancy as a metaphor for life's middle path, neither grasping for the sky nor sinking into darkness, but existing in steady equilibrium. Stories carved into stone panels depict figures standing on floating slabs, watching the horizon as the sun rose behind them. These carvings emphasize stillness, observation, and patience, a reflection of how they perceived their relationship with nature. Their ceremonial practices often took place on the largest stone rafts, which they called quiet circles. These platforms were arranged in ring formations near the coastline, each anchored by ropes to heavy bedrock. The rings were aligned with specific lunar phases, and during the calmest nights, moonlight reflected off the water and through the stone's pale surface. The platforms glowed faintly from below, creating a soft halo around the participants. These gatherings involved storytelling, meditation, and silent observation of the water's slow movement. The Savican did not chant or sing loudly. Their rituals centered on stillness. Scientific parallels exist for the Savican's floating stones. Some volcanic regions produce stones that hover at various depths due to changes in density and water absorption. Certain types of engineered cement incorporating gas pockets can achieve the same effect. The Savican, however, relied on natural material shaped for buoyancy rather than creating it artificially. Their understanding of density and buoyancy was intuitive, built from centuries of trial and error. By carving deep grooves and smoothing others, they regulated how water flowed across the stone's surface, adjusting its stability. This kind of tacit engineering demonstrates a sophisticated grasp of material behavior without formal scientific terminology. Their homes and platforms were designed to move slightly, offering resilience against storms. When waves rose, the stone rafts would flex and shift, dissipating energy instead of breaking. Observers found that Savican settlements often survived seasonal storms better than fixed structures on land. The motion distributed force evenly across the platform's surface, reducing stress and fractures. Their engineering approach resembles modern floating architecture, though developed many centuries earlier. The Savican created underwater gardens near their homes by placing stone rafts just beneath the surface to serve as anchors for kelp and other aquatic plants. Over time, these gardens formed a network of drifting green corridors beneath the walkways. Small fish and crustaceans thrived in these environments, creating an ecological system that benefited both humans and marine life. Because the stone rafts moved gently with the tides, they allowed sunlight to reach the plants from different angles, enhancing growth. The gardens became both a food source and a meditative space where residents observed the slow dance of kelp beneath their feet. One of the most fascinating Savican inventions was their submerged reflection chambers. These were created by carving out hollow spaces in larger stone rafts and lining the interiors with polished mineral surfaces. When light filtered through the water into these chambers, it created layered reflections that shifted with each wave. People entered the chambers through small wooden hatches above and sat in near silence watching the light ripple through the water. The chambers became places of contemplation where individuals confronted their thoughts in the company of moving reflections. Some chambers were tuned to produce resonant hums when water pressure reached certain levels, adding an acoustic dimension to the experience. A significant portion of the Savicans' recorded knowledge was etched into stone tiles embedded into their floating platforms. These tiles were arranged in patterns that could only be fully read when water levels reached certain heights. During exceptionally low tides, new sections of the archive became visible. High tides concealed them again. This design reflected their belief that understanding should come gradually, appearing only when conditions aligned. The tide served as a teacher, revealing information at its own pace. Many tiles described astronomical observations, water behavior, and seasonal patterns, blending practical knowledge with philosophical meaning. The decline of the Savican tribes likely came from a combination of geological changes and resource depletion. Over several generations, the high-quality buoyant stone became harder to find as deep layers were exhausted. Additionally, sea levels rose steadily, submerging some of their oldest structures beyond safe use. While they adapted for a time by building taller walkways and longer tethers, the changing environment eventually forced them to relocate inland. Their floating settlements gradually sank or drifted beyond reach, leaving behind only scattered remnants along the coast. Divers exploring the region today occasionally report finding fragments of smooth stone resting on the seafloor. When lifted, some fragments still exhibit partial buoyancy, rising slowly in the water before settling again. These remnants offer a glimpse into the Savican world, a civilization that chose balance over dominance, quiet observation over noise, and gentle motion over rigid form. Their legacy lives not in monuments, but in the idea that harmony with the environment can be built from materials already present, shaped patiently into forms that move with the water rather than resisting it.
The Arcala Star Mist Islands are described in maritime logs as a chain of remote landforms where atmospheric moisture behaves unusually compared to surrounding regions. The islands sit in an area where warm equatorial air meets a cooler southern current, producing a persistent layer of pale luminous mist. The unusual shimmer is most likely caused by high concentrations of suspended salt aerosols, which reflect and scatter moonlight in a way that appears brighter than typical marine A's. Sailors historically assumed the glow came from bioluminescent particles in the atmosphere, but no consistent biological explanation has been confirmed. Most geological surveys mention that the islands themselves are of volcanic origin, fragmented from an older collapsed caldera that now sits below sea level. The terrain includes narrow obsidian ridges, mineral terraces, and shallow tide pools where evaporation constantly replenishes airborne crystals. Reports mention that the eastern island contains strange patterns carved into its basalt cliffs. They appear as overlapping spirals, grids, and elongated star shapes that were likely created by natural erosion processes combined with salt crust formation.
Some researchers propose that strong lateral winds may be carving particulate matter across the stone surfaces at consistent angles, resulting in repeated motifs that only appear intentional. The formations are also partially influenced by temperature-driven fracturing of volcanic glass, which naturally forms polygonal breaks resembling symbols. Despite their natural origin, many early explorers believed the markings were evidence of an old maritime culture, but no reliable artifacts, pottery, or tools have been found to support that assumption. The water surrounding the islands contains unusually high levels of rare trace minerals, including lithium, boron, and fluorine. These concentrations are likely the result of deep ocean hydrothermal activity beneath the region. When warm mineralized water rises from vents and mixes with cold ocean currents, it forms shimmering surface gradients, which might explain the glowing bands observed on especially calm nights. A few scientific expeditions collected sediment cores showing alternating dark and pale layers, suggesting cyclical eruptions over millennia. These layers help reconstruct ancient volcanic phases that shaped the island chain's current broken structure. Temperature patterns on the islands are also unusual. The night air cools rapidly due to the absence of substantial vegetation cover, while the black volcanic surfaces retain heat that radiates upward long after sunset. This slow upward heat release interacts with the denser cold mist, creating swirling vortices that rise and collapse repeatedly. Observers describe them as moving columns of silver vapor. Meteorologists attribute this to thermal convection, where rising heat funnels through natural channels in the terrain and becomes trapped by dense humidity before dissipating. The local tide pools contain microbial mats that have adapted to extreme mineral content. These mats form intricate branching structures similar to stromatolites, though they are far more delicate. When disturbed by waves or wind, they release faint luminescent reactions caused by oxidizing compounds within the microbial membranes. This indirect light source might be another factor contributing to the region's reputation for nightly atmospheric glow. However, the brightness is subtle and only visible in darkness with minimal light pollution. Previous attempts to map the islands show that their boundaries shift slightly due to rapid coastal erosion. The volcanic rock is brittle, and constant wave pressure breaks slabs away in irregular intervals. Several older maps from the early 20th century depict a larger northern peninsula that no longer exists. Satellite imaging suggests that more collapses are expected, especially near the western cliffs where fissures have widened. This instability has discouraged long-term research stations from being established. Some mariners documented auditory phenomena around the islands. They described long, low-frequency hums that seemed to resonate across the water surface. Oceanographers studying the recordings propose that the sounds are generated when heavy waves pound into underwater lava tubes. When these tubes compress and release trapped air pockets, they form resonant tones similar to wind blowing across a hollow instrument. Since the island chain contains dozens of such tubes formed during ancient eruptions, the sounds can echo for long distances, especially during storm season. The absence of permanent fauna is notable. Only temporary seabird colonies appear during certain months, and small crustaceans inhabit the mineral pools. Larger land animals have not been observed, likely due to the limited vegetation, lack of freshwater springs, and sharp volcanic terrain. Botanical surveys identify only salt-tolerant mosses and small succulents that cling to crevices. They survive by absorbing moisture directly from the mist, a strategy found in other arid coastal plants. Because of the minimal vegetation and continual wind exposure, soil development is extremely slow. Most of the ground remains as bare rock with thin pockets of mineral dust. Researchers studying atmospheric chemistry collected samples of the mist and discovered high reflectivity compared to surrounding regions. Microscopic examination revealed that the droplets contained crystallized halos of salt that formed delicate hexagonal sheets around tiny cores. These reflective crystals help scatter even minimal moonlight, which enhances the perceived brightness at night. The formation process occurs when warm, saturated air rises from tide pools and cools rapidly in elevation, causing rapid crystallization. This process is rare because it requires very specific humidity and temperature cycles. The region's geography also creates visual distortions at night. Thermal layers shift the density of the air, bending light rays differently depending on altitude. As a result, distant silhouettes may appear stretched or shimmering. Some explorers describe structures that seem to rise above the island and then fade instantly. These were likely optical mirages produced by layered mist with alternating temperatures. Similar effects occur in deserts and tundras, though much less commonly above the ocean. One of the most discussed features is the central basin on the largest island, which resembles a crater filled with shallow brine. The water here has a unique texture, almost oily due to high salinity and mineral concentration. When wind blows across its surface, the ripples create complex interference patterns that reflect light in multiple directions. This basin is believed to be a remnant of the original caldera before it partially collapsed and filled with seawater. Mineral precipitates line the inner walls in bands, offering clues about past water levels and evaporation phases. The Star Mist Islands also produce electrical discharges on certain nights. These are not lightning bolts, but small corona-like glows that appear along the highest ridges. They occur when charged particles accumulate during dry atmospheric conditions. When mist moves across a rocky peak, friction generates tiny static discharges that faintly illuminate the stone edges. This effect is similar to St. Elmo's fire observed on ships, though weaker and more diffuse. Despite their isolation, the islands remain a subject of interest because they represent a natural laboratory for studying interactions between humidity, mineral aerosols, geothermal activity, and light scattering. Their combination of geological youth, shifting coastal shapes, unique atmospheric chemistry, and rare microbial communities provide multiple fields of scientific value. Even without evidence of ancient human presence, the natural processes shaping the islands continue to generate unusual sights and sounds that contribute to their mysterious reputation.
The region known as the Nahala Quartz Lantern Shores is documented as a narrow coastal arc where crystalline sediments accumulate in unusual concentrations. Geological surveys show that the beaches consist of crushed quartz mixed with fragments of feldspar and translucent silica nodules, producing a reflective appearance under both sunlight and moonlight. The quartz grains are abnormally large compared to typical beach sand, averaging between 1.5 and 3 millimeters. These grains scatter light at higher intensity, giving the shoreline a faint glow at dusk. The optical effect increases when waves recede, leaving a thin reflective film that amplifies refracted light from the horizon. Historical notes from early maritime expeditions mention that the shore was once part of a larger sandstone formation that eroded over thousands of years. As waves gradually wore down the cliffs, the quartz veins inside the sandstone were released and concentrated along the coast. Because quartz is highly resistant to chemical weathering, it persisted while softer components dissolved or drifted away. Over time, tides created a natural sorting mechanism, pushing heavier quartz grains inland and lighter silts outward. The result is a beach surface that appears almost metallic in certain angles, especially when the moon is low. The inland area behind the shoreline contains shallow plateaus where mineral-rich groundwater once pooled. Evidence of past hydrological activity is visible in the layered silica crusts that cover the ground. These crusts consist of micro-thin sheets of opaline silica forming overlapping disks often referred to by researchers as glass petals. They fracture easily when touched, producing a delicate chiming noise due to their brittleness and the tension stored in their layers. These crusts formed during long dry cycles when evaporating groundwater left behind supersaturated silica deposits. When humidity drops significantly, the layers contract and break, creating faint sounds that earlier travelers misinterpreted as rhythmic signals from within the Earth. Modern mineralogical analysis shows that the silica-rich environment creates ideal conditions for the development of rare microcrystalline structures. Some appear in radio clusters resembling starbursts. These formations are not luminous by themselves, but their refractive properties cause light to scatter in a way that gives the illusion of internal glow under low-angle illumination.
This optical phenomenon is often mistaken for bioluminescence, yet no biological luminescent species have been confirmed in these locations. The area also supports a unique pattern of tidal motion because of its position between two converging coastal currents. One current pulls warmer equatorial water toward the coast, while the opposing current pushes colder polar water northward. When they meet near the quartz lantern shores, the temperature differential causes stratification. The upper warm layer and the lower cool layer create internal waves beneath the surface, which subtly modulate the height and rhythm of surface waves. This contributes to long, smooth receding motions that reveal the glowing quartz bed for extended periods. Observers often describe the waves as synchronized despite windy conditions, an effect explained by internal density-driven oscillations. Sediment samples collected from the deeper coastal zone contain traces of lithium and beryllium, suggesting erosion from an ancient granitic source. Geological mapping indicates that the inland ridge once held a granite dome that fractured and eroded. Over millions of years, the fragments were carried downstream by rivers and distributed along the coastline. Many of these particles retain their original transparency due to minimal chemical alteration. The rarity of such pristine quartz grains makes the site distinct from typical beach ecosystems. Further inland, small cavities beneath the silica crusts hold pockets of compressed air that vibrate when wind passes through hairline cracks. These vibrations produce faint harmonic tones, especially at night when temperatures shift rapidly. The tones vary depending on the size and shape of the cavities, forming natural resonant chambers. Researchers compare the effect to low-frequency Aeolian instruments or natural lithophones. The acoustic environment adds to the area's reputation for serene but otherworldly ambiance. Although the sounds have no cultural or anthropogenic origin, early visitors believe the tones were produced by hidden communities or signaling mechanisms. Botanical presence is minimal due to lack of organic soil. Only a few hardy species adapted to mineral substrates survive. These include halophytic shrubs that extract moisture from coastal fog and store it in waxy stems. Lichens form pale patches across the silica surfaces, anchoring themselves with chemical etching that slowly breaks down the glassy crust. Their metabolic processes contribute micro amounts of organic matter into the environment, gradually enabling the formation of small soil pockets where other opportunistic plants may eventually grow. However, the region overall remains barren compared to typical coasts. Animal life consists primarily of insects and small nocturnal crustaceans that burrow beneath quartz layers to avoid temperature fluctuations. Certain beetle species exhibit reflective exoskeletons that help them scatter heat. These insects feed on microorganisms that grow within moisture trapped between quartz grains. No larger mammals inhabit the area due to lack of fresh water sources. Seabirds occasionally land on the coast but do not establish colonies, likely because the reflective sand confuses depth perception during landing. One notable environmental process in the quartz lantern shores is the consistent formation of fog arcs. These arcs appear as curved streaks of light within dense morning fog. The effect occurs when sunlight interacts with uniformly sized quartz dust suspended in the air. As wind lifts the fine dust from the beach surface, the particles become airborne and form a haze. The refractive index of quartz allows the formation of diffuse halos similar to ice crystal halos in polar regions. The arcs lack the bright spectral colors of typical rainbows, but display a soft white curvature across the fog layer. Temperature extremes are common due to the high albedo of the quartz sand. During the day, intense sunlight reflects rather than absorb, lowering surface temperatures compared to darker sand beaches. At night, however, the transparency of the grains allows heat to radiate freely, causing rapid cooling. These fluctuations influence atmospheric layering, creating temperature inversions that trap mist near the shore. The mist acts as a diffusing medium, softening the glow emitted by the quartz below. Historical accounts from early travelers describe lantern-like effects created when moonlight passed through the quartz grains. Many believe the sand itself emitted light, but scientific investigation shows the effect results from strong retroreflection, a phenomenon where light returns in the direction it came from rather than scattering broadly. This makes the sand appear brighter when viewed from certain angles, especially when the observer stands between the light source and the reflective surface. While no evidence supports claims of ancient civilizations in the region, there are reports of linear grooves carved into inland rock faces. These grooves align with old drainage paths formed when mineral-rich water flowed down the slopes. As the water evaporated, it left mineral residue that hardened into raised edges, eventually channeling more flow and deepening the grooves. Over centuries, the process produced patterns resembling intentional inscriptions. Chemical analysis confirms that the lines consist of layered silica, not carved stone. In modern times, the area is monitored for its potential role in studying high reflectivity surfaces and their influence on microclimates. The quartz lantern shores offer insights into albedo feedback loops, including how reflective terrains affect wind formation, fog retention, and nocturnal cooling cycles. The location also provides a natural analog for studying early Earth environments where silica-rich landscapes were more common. Despite its remote and barren nature, the region continues attracting interest due to its distinctive optical, geological, and acoustic phenomenon. Each contributes to the perception of the shores as glowing, whispering, and shimmering, qualities produced entirely by natural processes interacting in rare balance.
The region identified as the Astral Reef of Tulamir is an isolated shallow water shelf extending across a submerged volcanic plateau. The defining characteristic of this reef is its formation upon basaltic pillars rather than standard carbonate structures, creating a series of vertical columns rising from the seabed. These columns are remnants of ancient lava flows that cooled rapidly under seawater, forming hexagonal basalt prisms. Over thousands of years, these prisms became anchor points for specialized marine organisms that gradually built layered platforms resembling terraces. The unique geological base results in a reef that displays both volcanic and biological architecture. Unlike tropical coral systems dependent on warm currents, the Tulamir Reef developed under conditions of fluctuating temperatures caused by intermittent upwelling. Cold, nutrient-rich water rises from the deep trench adjacent to the plateau, supplying silica, nitrates, and trace minerals. This creates an environment where siliceous sponges, rather than calcium carbonate corals, dominate the foundational structure. Their skeletal frameworks harden into glass-like lattices that cling tightly to the basalt columns. As generations accumulate, the sponges fuse into dense, semi-transparent matrices that refract light in complex angular patterns. The water clarity around the astral reef is unusually high due to low plankton density during most of the year. When sunlight penetrates the clear water and passes through the sponge structures, it scatters into prismatic beams. Divers report that beams appear suspended in space like elongated crystals. Measurements confirm that the angular scattering corresponds with the alignment of the siliceous fibers. Each fiber behaves like a microscopic optical channel. The region's nickname, astral, originated from the star-like bursts created when clusters of sponge spicules intersect with light. Biological surveys identify several species unique to the reef. Among these are filament-drifting algae that anchor to the silica skeletons. Their long hair-like structures form dense curtains that sway with internal tides. When disturbed by passing fish, the algae release tiny bioluminescent particles. These particles glow briefly before dissolving, creating faint trails that resemble dust suspended in water. The glow results from a chemical reaction between stored luciferin compounds and oxygen released from enzymatic membranes. Small crustaceans inhabit the crevices between basalt prisms. They have evolved flattened bodies to move efficiently within narrow passages. Their exoskeletons contain reflective microplates that scatter low light, allowing them to camouflage within the reef's prismatic environment. Acoustic studies show that these crustaceans generate faint clicking noises used for communication.
The clicks echo against the natural basalt columns, creating repetitive pulses that travel farther than expected for such small organisms. One of the most notable features of the Tulamir Reef is the oscillation of internal waves. These waves move beneath the surface layer, driven by density differences between warm and cold water. As they pass through the reef, the internal waves compress and release water within the porous sponge structures. This motion produces rhythmic shimmering patterns across the reef surface. Instruments detect slight pressure changes inside the hollow sponge cavities, indicating periodic squeezing and expansion that occur in sync with subsurface wave cycles. Geologists studying the region confirm that the basalt columns continue several meters below the sediment layer. The columns are fractured in a grid-like pattern due to thermal stress from ancient volcanic events. These fractures create pockets that trap methane bubbles rising from deeper layers. When bubbles escape through narrow pathways, they form constant streams that rise along the sides of the columns. Light refracting through these rising bubbles produce momentary glints that contribute to the reef's visually dynamic behavior. Microbial mats cover some basalt surfaces where sunlight is sufficient. These mats consist of photoautotrophic bacteria capable of storing energy during short daylight periods and surviving long periods of low light. Their coloration ranges from pale blue to deep violet depending on pigment composition. Spectral analysis shows they absorb wavelengths typical of deep water environments despite existing in a shallower setting. This suggests an evolutionary adaptation to variable light conditions caused by shifting turbidity from internal currents. In the deeper sections of the reef, glass sponges grow into towering structures that resemble inverted cones. The cones channel water upward through narrow central chambers. Flow sensors reveal that water velocity inside these chambers increases significantly, enabling efficient filtration of suspended nutrients. Each sponge filters dozens of liters of water per hour, contributing to the reef's overall clarity. Dead sponges eventually collapse, leaving behind hollow silica cages that become habitats for juvenile fish and mollusks. Fish populations around Tulamir are moderate but diverse. Species include silver-bodied swimmers with slow, deliberate movements adapted for navigating complex optical environments. Their scales contain reflective guanine crystals that help them redirect light. This makes them more difficult both by predators and by prey, as their silhouettes blend into scattered light fields. Behavioral studies observe that these fish rely heavily on lateral line sensitivity rather than vision. Surface currents above the reef display spiral patterns due to interactions between wind-forced drift and subsurface topography. Satellite imaging captures rotating gyres forming above the plateau, driven by periodic bursts of cold water rising through the trench. These gyres concentrate floating organic matter, creating feeding zones for seabirds. Although birds do not nest in the area, they visit regularly to fish on surface blooms. Sediment layers surrounding the basalt columns contain microscopic shards of volcanic glass. These shards reflect traces of the reef's formative eruptions. 7 million years ago, subsequent eruptions added new columns which merged and formed the foundation for biological colonization. Over millennia, weathering reduced exposed sharp edges, making the columns suitable for sponge attachment. Chemical analysis of water samples taken near the reef reveals elevated levels of dissolved silica compared to typical coastal systems. This high silica content sustains the growth of sponges and siliceous algae. At the same time, carbonate concentrations remain low, limiting traditional coral formation. This balance creates a reef ecosystem structurally distinct from tropical coral reefs, yet equally complex. Sponges act as primary architects, followed by algae, microorganisms, and invertebrates. One peculiar phenomenon documented in the region is the appearance of shimmering sheets that drift across the water. These sheets form when thin layers of silica-rich plankton accumulate and reflect light at specific angles. As wind alters the surface, the reflective sheets ripple and fold, resembling slow-moving waves of glass. They dissipate quickly when disturbed, but reform under stable conditions. Mariners once mistaken them for signs of thin ice or reflective oil, but scientific inspections show purely biological origins. Bioacoustic research reveals that the reef generates continuous low-frequency hums. These hums arise from resonance between water movement and the internal cavities of basalt columns. As waves strike the outer edges, vibrations travel downward and activate resonant modes inside the hexagonal shafts. The resulting frequencies are below human hearing, but influence the behavior of marine animals. Some species of fish use these vibrations for orientation, similar to how terrestrial animals use geomagnetic cues. Although the astral reef appears stable, portions of the basalt platform continue to subside slowly. Movement occurs at rates measured in millimeters per year. This gradual sinking increases pressure on deeper sponge structures. As sponges collapse, new generations occupy their place. The cycle ensures continuous vertical development of biological layers, producing alternating patterns of silica and organic material in sediment cores. The reef's optical environment draws scientific interest for its potential applications in understanding underwater light transport. The interaction between hexagonal basalt columns, glass sponge matrices, rising methane bubbles, and reflective microfauna creates an unusually complex refractive system. Researchers model these interactions to explore how natural structures guide light. Data from Tulamir assists in designing underwater communication systems that utilize refracted light paths. The region experiences predictable blooms of bioluminescent algae during seasonal upwellings. These events occur when nutrient-rich deep water reaches the surface, triggering rapid growth. At night, wave motion disturbs the algae, creating soft blue glows along the reef edges. The light follows patterns aligned with internal currents, producing trailing arcs that extend for several meters before fading. Deep trenches bordering the plateau provide habitats for cold water species that occasionally migrate into the reef zone. This mixing of warm and cold water organisms results in rare species interactions not seen in ordinary reefs. Genetic sampling identifies hybridization events among certain sponge and crustacean species, suggesting this transitional zone encourages evolutionary experimentation.
Overall, the astral reef of Tulamir functions as a complex system shaped by volcanic origins, silica-dependent biology, optical interactions, and rhythmic hydrodynamics. Its structure reflects a continuous interplay between geological inheritance and biological adaptation, producing a distinctive environment that differs fundamentally from tropical coral ecosystems. The region known as the Stone Current Oracle of Nalukar lies within a chain of weather-shaped limestone ridges that extend across a shallow marine basin. The defining characteristic of this area is a collection of naturally formed stone channels, depressions, and conduits carved by centuries of fluctuating tides. These interconnected pathways form a labyrinth that redirects water in highly predictable patterns. The channels differ in width, depth, and curvature, causing water to accelerate, decelerate, spiral, and split into multiple streams depending on tidal height. Observers note that the entire system behaves like a natural hydraulic instrument, functioning without human modification. During mid-tide, when water levels reach optimal alignment with the carved depressions, the flow produces steady resonances. The sound arises from water shearing along the walls of narrow channels, generating sustained tones. The limestone ridges contain alternating layers of dense and porous material, and the contrast influences acoustic behavior. Dense layers amplify mid-range frequencies, while porous layers absorb sharp highs. As a result, the area generates a low, continuous hum during specific tidal sequences. Geophysical analysis indicates that vibrational energy transfers along the ridges and propagates through the stone network. The inhabitants historically associated with Nalukar built their settlements near these formations. Archaeological remains reveal circular stone platforms arranged around central depressions. The platforms sit on elevated zones safe from shifting tides.
Evidence shows that the inhabitants observed water flow patterns extremely closely. Stone markers carved with smooth grooves likely recorded the sequence of channel activation throughout tidal cycles. Each marker features a series of parallel notches that correspond with varying water levels. These notches align with the slope of the basin, suggesting the inhabitants tracked minute changes in tidal amplitude. The Nalukar people developed a practice of mapping tide-induced vibrations. Excavations uncover thin limestone tablets etched with sinuous lines. Researchers interpret these etchings as representations of tonal sequences produced by water. The thickness and curvature of lines vary, indicating differences in sound. Because the stone current network generated tones correlated with tidal height, the inhabitants may have predicted shifts in weather or long-term oceanic patterns by listening to the vibrations. Their practice did not rely on deities or myth, but instead focused on the quiet observation of natural rhythms. Sediment samples taken from cavities within the channels contain microfossils indicating that the system formed more than 11,000 years ago. Over time, water dissolved softer limestone, leaving behind harder bands. This sculpting process produced stepped ridges resembling shallow bowls. As tides rose, water spilled into these bowls before overflowing into adjacent channels. The transition points between bowls created miniature waterfalls. Flow sensors show that even small waterfalls contribute significantly to the tonal profile. When water falls through narrow apertures, it creates pressure waves that resonate like the reeds of a wind instrument. During seasonal storms, water volume increases dramatically. When this happens, the network generates harmonic clusters that differ from its regular hum. These clusters form when multiple channels fill simultaneously. Each channel acts as an acoustic cavity, and together they produce a layered soundscape. The inhabitants of Nalukar may have used these storm-induced harmonics as early warning signals. Patterns in the harmonics indicate weather severity. Stronger storms produce lower resonances because heavier water pressure forces deeper cavities to vibrate. Coral fragments found along the basin's northern perimeter display unique growth rings. These rings exhibit irregular spacing, suggesting periodic interruption by shifting turbidity. This supports the theory that water flow through Nalukar channels affected nearby ecosystems. Changes in water movement influence sediment distribution, light penetration, and nutrient availability. Algae samples taken from the region contain pigments typical of environments with intermittent exposure to filtered light. The limestone labyrinth filters sunlight through gaps and openings, producing diffuse illumination across shallow pools. Some channels funnel water underground before releasing it again farther downslope. These subsurface flows create intermittent surges that appear without visible cause. Pressure monitors detect sudden upward pulses when trapped air escapes through narrow outlets. These pulses contribute to a rhythmic pattern that repeats every few minutes. Because they occur independently of surface waves, they create an internal rhythm beneath the audible hum. Marine ecologists observe that fish species navigate these pulses to conserve energy by aligning their bodies with the pressure flow. The inhabitants left behind artifacts that show deliberate placement of small stones within certain channels. The stones do not obstruct the flow, but redirect it subtly. Their arrangement suggests that the inhabitants experimented with modifying tonal output without altering the overall structure. When water moves around the stones, it generates micro-eddies. These eddies add faint overtones to the primary resonance. Although the system remained primarily natural, the inhabitants may have adjusted it to enhance specific patterns. Beneath the ridges, there is a layer of compacted sediment containing shells of species that no longer inhabit the basin. The distribution of these shells shows that the basin once had a different water level. As sea levels fluctuated over millennia, the position of the tidal network relative to the ocean also shifted. The current alignment produces the strongest resonance, but earlier configurations likely generated different acoustic properties. Geological modeling suggests that earlier water levels would have activated additional channels no longer reached by tides today. Modern hydrological studies use dye tracers to understand the flow paths. When dye enters the upper channels, it disperses in spiraling streams. These spirals form because the channels bend at angles shaped by differential erosion. Some spirals complete full rotations before merging with downstream currents. The patterns reveal a natural hydraulic algorithm dictated by the geometry of the basin. Engineers studying Naluker compare the system to fluid logic circuits in which water paths represent inputs and outputs. The tonal characteristics vary depending on salinity. During high salinity periods, water density increases and flow speed changes. This alters the pitch of resonances. Recordings over several years confirm a correlation between pitch variation and seasonal changes. Because the Naluker people lived near these formations for generations, they may have recognized seasonal patterns through sound. Their tablets display repeating marks that appear to represent cycles spanning months or years. These rhythm tracking habits imply the use of long-term environmental observation. In quieter zones of the network, water flows through broad, shallow depressions. Here, the motion slows enough for fine sediment to settle. These areas support seagrass growth. The seagrass beds reduce water turbulence and stabilize the sediment. They also add drag to the flow, subtly shaping resonance patterns. The interaction between vegetation and acoustic channels forms a dynamic system in which biological and geological components constantly adjust one another. Some depressions collect rainwater during monsoon seasons. Rainwater dilutes the salinity and temporarily changes the sound profile. This dilution increases flow complexity as fresh water interacts with incoming tides. Conductivity measurements reveal sudden shifts during these events. Because rainwater is less dense, it forms a surface layer that moves faster across the channels, altering pitch and tone. Inhabitants may have recognized these changes as markers of seasonal transitions. The limestone architecture hosts numerous microhabitats. Small crustaceans occupy the crevices between ridges. Their movements stir sediment and influence water clarity. In clear periods, more light penetrates the basin, increasing evaporation from exposed surfaces. Evaporation further alters salinity, creating feedback loops between atmosphere and channel acoustics. One phenomenon frequently documented is the appearance of concentric ripple arrays. These arrays form when water enters circular depressions at specific angles. The ripples expand outward until they meet incoming waves from adjacent channels, creating interference patterns. The patterns move slowly, forming shifting grids. Because the depressions lie across multiple elevations, interference spreads in cascading layers, resulting in visual formations that resemble overlapping rings. The acoustic resonance of Naluker also influences marine species distribution. Some fish gather near resonant nodes where vibrations guide movement. Others avoid zones with high resonance density. Studies reveal that certain species use the hum for orientation, similar to how birds navigate using atmospheric infrasound. The hum acts as a constant reference. Overall, the stone current oracle of Naluka represents a complex interplay between water flow, geological structure, biological development, and acoustic resonance. The inhabitants did not worship the system but studied it, documenting the predictable sequences of sound and flow. Their observations reflect an early form of environmental pattern analysis rooted in careful listening and long-term patience.
The Ashtaran kelp forest guilds are described as one of the most structured ecological societies found in cold-tempered archipelagos, where submerged forests rise through dim green water like underwater cathedrals. These forests are anchored by kelp species capable of reaching lengths of 30 to 40 meters, forming vertical ecosystems with multiple tiers. Within these environments, the guilds refer to groups of species that share cooperative or complementary functions. Although not human societies, the organization and specialization among these species create a pattern that resembles structured communities. The kelp forests themselves provide the primary architecture. Their flexible stipes sway with tidal movement, controlling the flow of nutrients and altering light penetration. This modification of light intensity allows photosynthesis to occur on multiple levels, supporting a wide variety of phototrophic and heterotrophic species. The canopy zone, formed near the surface, hosts organisms requiring higher light levels, while mid-kelp layers host species adapted to diffused sunlight. The understory remains dim and quiet, becoming a shelter for slow-moving or nocturnal organisms. One of the primary guilds in these forests is the grazer guild. This includes sea urchins, herbivorous gastropods, and several fish species that control algal overgrowth. Without these grazers, epiphytic algae would coat the kelp blades, blocking their ability to photosynthesize. The movement of grazers between layers of the forest keeps the ecosystem balanced. In locations where grazer populations collapse, usually due to diseases or shifts in water temperature, kelp forests rapidly decline and transition into barren seafloor habitats. The Ashtaran regions have documented several episodes of such collapses, followed by slow natural recovery. Another component is the forager-hunter guild. These species include medium-sized predatory fish, crustaceans, and cephalopods. They regulate populations of small herbivores and zooplankton, preventing population spikes that would disrupt nutrient cycles. In many observed cases, these predators adjust their hunting depth based on tidal flow. During rising tides, they shift upward to intercept plankton-feeding fish. During receding tides, they move downward to forage among the lower fronds. This behavior creates a rhythmic pattern similar to daily migrations on land, but governed by water movement instead of sunlight cycles. Structural engineers are another guild, consisting of species that physically modify the environment. Sea otters, large crabs, and several invertebrate builders fall into this category. These animals break, redistribute, or attach materials to the kelp stipes, forming microhabitats. For example, crustaceans attach shell fragments or sediment particles to sheltered surfaces, creating layers where smaller species hide from predators. The presence of these modifications increases biodiversity significantly. When structural engineers are absent, the environment becomes more uniform and niche diversity declines. There is also the nutrient cycling guild, composed of filter feeders like sponges, mussels, and tube-dwelling worms. They extract suspended particles from the water, releasing nutrient-rich waste that supports microbial and algal growth. Their activity enhances nitrogen availability, which is essential for kelp growth. Observations from Ashtaran region show that when filter feeder density increases, kelp blade growth becomes more rapid and more resilient to seasonal temperature changes. This interdependence underscores how each guild stabilizes the overall system. The highest tier of the forest, the canopy guild, includes seabirds and surface foraging fish. Although these animals interact only with the top layers, they influence the entire forest. Droppings from birds introduce external nutrients, particularly phosphorus, into the water. This resource is limited in many cold marine ecosystems, so the input from seabirds increases productivity across the entire kelp forest. The canopy guild also provides shade and movement patterns that help juvenile fish avoid open water predators. Ashtaran researchers categorize these guilds not only based on diet, but also by their contribution to ecosystem stability. A guild is considered foundational when its removal results in widespread decline. The kelp itself is foundational, but so are urchins, otters, filter feeders, and mid-level predators. When foundational guilds fail, the system collapses slowly at first, then rapidly. With complete collapse, kelp blades detach, float upward, and drift away. The forest transitions into a low biodiversity state dominated by encrusting algae and scavenger species. Historical data from Ashtaran Marine Institutes recorded at least 5 major kelp forest collapses over the past 3 centuries. Most were caused by temperature anomalies linked to shifting ocean currents, although disease outbreaks in key species also contributed. During these collapses, grazer populations sometimes increased uncontrollably, stripping the remaining kelp and preventing regrowth. Recovery often required the return of keystone species, particularly predators that controlled herbivore numbers.
Once predators returned, kelp seedlings had space to grow and the forest could regenerate over several decades. The kelp forest guilds also contribute to long-term carbon storage. Kelp grows rapidly and absorbs significant amounts of carbon dioxide. When sections break off and sink, they transport carbon to deeper waters where it remains stored for extended periods. This process makes kelp forests important components of natural climate regulation. The guilds enhance this effect by maintaining healthy growth rates and reducing stress factors that would otherwise inhibit kelp expansion. Beneath the forest, the understory guild occupies a dim environment where slow water movement creates stable conditions. Species here include brittle stars, small fish, and microorganisms that thrive on decomposing organic matter. Their slow metabolism allows them to function efficiently with minimal resources. Many of these organisms are nocturnal, rising slightly into the mid-layers at night to feed. Their presence maintains the breakdown of dead material, preventing accumulation that could block water flow or harbor pathogens. The intertwining roles of all these guilds form a network resembling a cooperative society. Each member performs a specific task, and many depend on the actions of others. Although the system lacks intentional coordination, the outcome is a stable ecological structure that can persist for centuries when undisturbed. Studies of Ashtaran kelp forests reveal that biodiversity increases resilience. Systems with more guild members recover faster after disturbances, while those with fewer guilds experience prolonged instability. Some researchers apply these findings to modern ecosystem management. By identifying foundational guilds, conservationists can focus on protecting the species that support the entire structure. In the Ashtaran region, protective measures include regulating fishing in predator-rich zones, monitoring disease in urchins, and maintaining water quality to support filter feeders. These strategies aim to preserve the balance that defines the kelp forests. The forests provide an analog for ancient marine ecosystems that existed long before human observation. Fossilized kelp impressions found in preserved sediments suggest that similar multi-layered ecosystems existed millions of years ago. The same pattern of grazer, predator, filter feeder, and structural engineer guild appears in ancient records, indicating that this organizational structure is deeply rooted in marine evolution. In many ways, Ashtaran kelpfost guilds demonstrate how complexity arises naturally when multiple species coexist in resource-rich habitats. Energy flows through these layers like a gentle current, shifting from sunlight captured at the surface down to decomposers in the shadows. Each movement of water alters conditions slightly, and each species responds in ways that enhance stability. Through these interactions, the kelp forests reveal a system that is both delicate and enduring, defined by interdependence and shaped by slow, rhythmic cycles of growth and decline.
The shore was quiet where the water met the low, breathing light that drifted between the kelp pillars. A slow shimmer moved through the shallows, not from sunlight, but from faint bioluminescent threads that pulsed like veins in the water itself. This region was known for tides that behaved differently from the surrounding sea, as if responding to an unseen pull deeper below. Tall stands of kelp reached upward in broad green strokes, their surfaces carrying patterns etched by time and current, giving the impression that the plants themselves held a memory of the ocean's long history. The water was cold, steady, and dense with suspended particles that turned the environment into a soft, glowing haze. This place formed a natural cathedral of shifting greens and blue golds, where sound arrived softened and dissolved into the drifting patterns of the forest. Those who lived within this aquatic space formed a community bound to the living structures around them. Their habitation was both above and below the waterline, built into platforms woven from kelp fibers hardened through brine and fusion. These structures moved gently with the tide rather than resisting it. The people developed a life shaped entirely by the slow currents, by the rhythms of water passing between the great marine columns, and by the behavior of the organisms that thrived within this unusual ecosystem. They navigated through the kelp aisles with long, smooth strokes, avoiding any sudden movement that could disturb the delicate arrangement of growth. Every gesture was measured. Every choice seemed guided by an understanding that balance was essential for the forest to remain stable around them. They became known for their ability to read subtle changes in water tension. They noticed the way strands of kelp curved from unseen forces, how suspended sand drifted in slow spirals rather than straight lines, and how the glow of bioluminescent creature colonies shifted in brightness at certain hours of the cycle. These observations formed the basis of their culture. They lacked rigid structures of authority or formal institutions. Instead, knowledge flowed through a continuous process of watching, learning, and responding to the environment. Their survival depended on maintaining harmony within their surroundings, for the kelp forest was not merely a habitat, it was a dynamic organism that shaped the conditions of their existence. The community practiced an unusual form of mapping. Rather than drawing diagrams or marking fixed points, they created layered cords of treated kelp strands twisted together. Each cord carried patterns of tension built through knots, loops, and measured stretches. These acted as physical representations of tidal behavior, capturing the way currents strengthened or weakened at certain moon phases and preserving long-term observations of changes in water drift. The cords were stored within underwater alcoves grown from living kelp walls that branched outward to form protective chambers. Over many generations, these alcoves became archive forests, with hundreds of cords suspended like soft, flowing shelves of knowledge. A significant aspect of their skill involved reading the faint pulses of light produced by bioluminescent microbes that colonized specific kelp fronds. These microbes responded to chemical changes in the water, including nutrient content, temperature gradients, and the presence of certain plankton blooms. By watching the intensity and duration of the light, the people could predict shifts in the ecosystem long before such changes become noticeable by ordinary sensory means. This made them remarkably effective stewards of their environment. When the light dimmed in certain regions, they gently pruned or relocated kelp stands to prevent overcompetition. When it brightened too intensely, they adjusted water flow by weaving temporary barriers that guided currents to redistribute nutrients more evenly. Scientific parallels in modern marine biology suggest that ecosystems like this, though rare, can indeed reach extraordinary states of self-regulation. Studies of kelp forests show that they create microclimates underwater, altering turbulence, temperature, and oxygen diffusion. The people's attention to microsigns reflected a deep systematic observation approach comparable to early forms of ecological monitoring. Their tension cords bear similarities to quipu-like data structures found in ancient cultures, which encoded complex information through tactile patterns rather than written symbols. The kelp alcoves resemble natural reef archive systems where organisms maintain long-term records through growth layers and chemical markers. The behavior of light-emitting microbes provides another remarkable point of scientific reflection. Modern research shows that bioluminescent bacteria often signal environmental conditions. Shifts in salinity, pH, nutrient levels, and chemical compounds produced by other microorganisms can cause luminescent patterns to strengthen or fade. The community's reliance on such signs mirrors practices used by marine researchers today who deploy bioluminescent sensors to track ecological health. The forest they lived in became a living laboratory where every thread of light, every change in turbulence, and every drifting particle formed part of a coherent, readable system. Emotionally, the environment shaped their worldview. Movement through the kelp corridors created a sensation similar to walking through memory, soft, layered, and shifting with each subtle change of current. The people often described the forest as something that listened, reacting gently to presence and intention. Sound moved differently here, arriving muted and dispersed across the kelp blades. This quiet shaped their communication into low, measured tones that did not reverberate harshly. Their rituals were simple, often involved drifting together within regions of high light concentration during certain tide cycles, observing the glow and allowing themselves to be carried by slow currents.
They interpreted these communal drifts as times to reflect on past decisions and future possibilities, letting the water's movement guide their thoughts. Every aspect of their life connected back to a wider understanding. The kelp forest existed not as a backdrop but as a partner. Their world expanded slowly outward as they discovered how certain kelp strains interacted with others, forming networks of chemical signals that traveled surprising distances. These networks linked distant regions of the forest, enabling nutrient and energy flows that resembled the mycelial webs of terrestrial forests. Their mapping cords included patterns representing these longer connections, revealing how the environment extended far beyond what the eye could see. They believed that understanding these unseen links was essential to maintaining the stability of their home. As cycles changed, the people adjusted their structures to adapt to shifting currents. Older platforms were dismantled gently, allowing the materials to drift into deeper regions where they decompose naturally. New constructions rose slowly, never exceeding what the local ecosystem could sustain. Their archives of tension cords guided these decisions, ensuring that past knowledge informed every alteration to the environment. Over generations, the forest became shaped not just by natural forces, but by the community's careful, respectful management. At the end of a cycle, when the glow dimmed and the water stilled, the people often gathered at the outer edges of the kelp isles. Here the currents were softer, and the sound of deeper tides carried through the pillars like a distant low hum. They let the quiet settle, watching the gentle sway of long fronds. The forest exhaled its slow rhythm, and the people allowed themselves to align with it, letting the dim light guide them back toward rest.
The fog drifted in slow, deliberate sheets across the shoreline, folding over itself like layers of pale fabric suspended in the air. The land here was shaped by cooling winds that swept down from distant, unseen ridges and created wide, resonant tremors across the sand. These tremors were soft enough not to be felt directly, but strong enough to influence the dunes and the shallow pools that formed between them. Each pool reflected the muted sky through a thin, shimmering distortion caused by the minerals suspended just beneath the surface. The entire region moved in an unhurried rhythm, its contours subtly shifting over time, as if the earth itself were breathing beneath the mist. The people of this place lived along a series of low terraces that were carved into the landscape through generations of careful shaping. Their dwellings were made from compacted silt, reinforced by fibrous plant roots that thrived in mineral-rich soil. The structures blended so naturally with the terrain that at a distance they appeared to be part of the land itself. These terraces were arranged to follow the silent tremor lines that pulsed through the region, and the alignment of their homes allowed them to feel slight resonances during certain periods, helping them anticipate environmental changes. The community's relationship with the land was one of deep sensitivity, as they recognized that the tremors shaped everything from weather patterns to the growth of local plants. Their culture centered around understanding the faint vibrations moving beneath the ground. They were not seismic events in the modern sense, not the rumblings of tectonic plates, but rather subtle oscillations produced by interactions between mineral layers deep below the surface. These oscillations created audible tones when they moved through certain types of rock formations. Over time, the people learned how to interpret these tones. They constructed hollow stone chambers positioned at key points along the terraces. When the tremors passed, they produced low, melodic hums within these chambers, almost like natural instruments embedded into the landscape. The core practice of the community involved listening to these resonant hums. Each chamber produced a slightly different frequency depending on its shape, depth, and orientation. By moving between chambers, the people could follow shifts in vibration patterns as the earth adjusted to seasonal cycles. These tones guided decisions related to planting, harvesting, and the movement of water across their terraces. They believed that the land communicated through these vibrations, expressing changes long before they became visible on the surface. Their interpretation of the hums formed a kind of language, one that required patience and attentive observation rather than spoken translation.
The practice resembled a form of early geophysical monitoring. Modern science recognizes that certain mineral-rich regions naturally create harmonic vibrations due to the interaction between quartz, clay layers, and groundwater movement. These mineral matrices can resonate when subjected to consistent pressure or fluid displacement, producing low-frequency sounds known as microtremors. Instruments today detect such vibrations to study subsurface structures, but this ancient community relied entirely on the auditory cues produced within their stone chambers. Their system, although simple in design, reflected an intuitive grasp of the principles underlying resonance, frequency variation, and the transmission of sound through different mediums. The people approached these hums not as warnings or omens, but as part of a continuous exchange with their environment. When the tone deepened, they knew that the ground was absorbing more moisture. When it brightened, they understood that the mineral content was shifting due to changes in water flow beneath the surface. Their daily routines incorporated long periods of quiet sitting near the chambers, listening carefully for fluctuations. They documented these changes through textured clay tablets pressed with subtle ridges, each ridge representing a variation in vibration strength. These tablets were stored in sheltered alcoves, forming an archive of generational knowledge. Emotionally, the hums shaped the rhythm of their lives. The sound was steady, grounding, and deeply calming. Many described it as the earth's slow breath, a presence that reminded them of stability during uncertain seasons. As children, they were taught to rest near the stone chambers during periods of heightened tremor activity, allowing the hum to soothe their thoughts. The tone resonated gently through their bodies, creating an effect similar to modern sound therapy, where low-frequency vibrations are used to relax the nervous system. For the people of the terraces, the hums were not merely tools for understanding the land, they were companions in quiet moments, anchors that kept their community connected to something deeper than themselves. Their worldview expanded from this relationship. They believed that the earth possessed an internal rhythm similar to a heartbeat, though slower and more diffuse through time. They saw themselves not as inhabitants of the land, but as listeners participating in the ongoing conversation between minerals, water, and shifting layers beneath the surface. Their stories described the ground as holding ancient memory, with each tremor representing a soft reminder of events that shaped the terrain long before any living person walked here. This perspective created a sense of continuity across generations, as every new listener felt linked to those who had listened before. As the seasons changed, the tones drifting through the chambers shifted gradually. During warm periods, the hums grew smoother, rolling gently through the terraces like distant echoes. During cooler months, the tones developed slight ripples, signaling denser layering as moisture settled and minerals crystallized differently. These patterns influenced how the people distributed their resources, how they navigated between their settlements, and even how they arranged the flow of water through their irrigation channels. Their actions reinforced the natural harmonics, ensuring that the chambers continued to resonate effectively across time. Their construction methods evolved slowly but thoughtfully. When older chambers showed signs of structural fatigue, the community reinforced them with mineral-rich clay sourced from deeper wells. They understood that changing the composition of the chamber even slightly could alter its resonance, so they repaired carefully, preserving the exact harmonics that had guided their ancestors. In this way, each chamber became a layered artifact, holding within it the history of countless seasons and the collective decisions shaped by listening to the hums. At the end of each cycle, when the mist thickened and visibility dropped to only a few lengths, the people would gather around the primary chamber. They sat quietly as the hum rippled outward, its low vibration passing through the ground and into their bones. They felt the sound rather than heard, letting it settle into their breathing. The mist folded around them, softening the edges of everything. The tone seemed to travel through the air and earth at once, creating a sense of gentle dissolution, as if the boundaries between listener and landscape were fading into a single field of stillness. When the hum eventually softened into silence, they rose without words, carrying the quiet resonance back with them into the terraces. The Austeron kelp forests form one of the quietest, least disturbed marine ecosystems in the southern temperate belt, and their guilds of inhabitants have developed structures of cooperation that give researchers a final glimpse into how remote ecosystems stabilize themselves over centuries. The kelp here grows in dense vertical corridors, sometimes reaching more than 30 meters in height, forming underwater rooms, vaults, and passageways that feel architectural rather than botanical. Marine biologists studying this region often mention that navigation inside these forests resembles walking through the ruins of an ancient cathedral, only everything is alive, swaying, and faintly glowing with bioluminescent microbial films. One of the most intriguing components of the Austeron ecosystem is the multi-species guild system. Rather than competing aggressively for resources, various species have adapted to divide space and tasks in ways that minimize conflict and stabilize the food web. This includes grazing strata, shelter rotation behaviors, nutrient cycling corridors, and seasonal migration loops that align with the kelp's yearly growth pattern. For instance, the wide-backed Austeron grazers feed only on the upper canopy fronds, while the shell-scaled nibblers clear algae on the lower layers, and the slender spirefish feed on microorganisms released when old fronds decay. Research expeditions consistently note that these feeding layers rarely overlap, almost as if the species evolved an unspoken agreement that prevents resource collapse. Another remarkable adaptation is the guild's internal early warning system. Certain fish species create specific movements when predators approach, sending pressure waves through the kelp corridors. These waves are picked up by other species long before direct visual detection is possible. Observers have recorded moments where hundreds of organisms shift direction simultaneously in reaction to a single pulse. Over time, scientists realized these signals aren't random panic responses. They are patterned, consistent, and vary depending on the type of threat. Some pulses trigger retreat deeper into the forests. Others prompt a tightening of group formations. A few, surprisingly, trigger outward dispersal, suggesting a strategic attempt to confuse or oversaturate the attention of would-be predators. Within the kelp itself, the microbial communities form additional guilds. Symbiotic bacteria live along the kelp's trunk-like stipes, processing minerals and exchanging nutrients that help the plants withstand colder seasonal currents. Some of these microbes glow faintly at night, creating lines of dim blue light that trace the vertical columns of the forest. The effect can look like an underwater city grid shimmering in the dark, a visual phenomenon that early explorers described in their logs decades before biologists identified the microbial species responsible. One long-term expedition documented how these forests change across a full year. During warmer months, the canopy openings widen, allowing more sunlight to enter, triggering a burst of primary productivity that feeds nearly every layer of the ecosystem. During colder seasons, the fronds close tightly, creating darkened chambers that many species use for protection. The shift is gradual, almost rhythmic, and everything within the forest adapts seamlessly to this seasonal breathing cycle. The Austeron guilds also present a rare example of behavioral continuity across generations. Several species practice what appears to be knowledge transfer from older individuals to younger ones through repeated movement patterns. Juveniles learn migration corridors by shadowing adults through spiraled loops within the kelp trails. These loops are so consistent that researchers can map them with high accuracy, revealing routes that have been used for decades, unchanged despite environmental fluctuations. Notably, these forests also show signs of ancient geological disturbances. Deep ridges along the seabed suggest that tectonic uplift shaped the region thousands of years ago, creating hard anchoring points where the earliest kelp stands took root. The guild systems that formed afterwards likely evolved around these anchor nodes, using them as stable centers of activity in an otherwise shifting marine landscape. By analyzing sediment cores from around these ridges, scientists have discovered spores and remains of earlier kelp species that no longer exist in the modern ecosystem, indicating a long lineage of forest succession. One area of the forest contains unusually tall kelp columns referred to by researchers as the pillar zone. Here, the kelp grows thicker and straighter, forming massive organic pillars that reach toward the surface. Within this zone, the gill dynamics become even more specialized. Certain species inhabit only the shadowed bases of the pillars, while others live exclusively near the top. This vertical partitioning restricts competition and creates microhabitats so specific that removing even one species would destabilize the entire column. Toward the outer edges of the Austeron forests, the kelp becomes sparser and shorter. Here, explorers often find lone sentry predators that patrol the openness between the forest and the deeper sea. Their role appears tied to balancing populations trying to expand beyond the safe zones. Without these predators, scientists speculate that herbivore numbers would rise too quickly, stripping the forests faster than they can regenerate. Another intriguing feature is a low-frequency hum detected throughout the ecosystem. Hydrophones record a continuous background vibration that seems to originate from water movement through the densest kelp regions. While mechanical in nature, its steady rhythm influences the behavior of nearby species, encouraging them to gather or disperse depending on its intensity. The hum also masks the sound of smaller creatures, offering them a layer of acoustic camouflage in an otherwise quiet ocean environment. The Austeron kelp forest guilds represent the final chapter of this exploration, not because they are the most dramatic, but because they embody the quiet, delicate balance that remote ecosystems achieve when left undisturbed for centuries. The system thrives not through dominance or rapid change, but through cooperation, partitioning, and long-term stability. Every species here contributes to the whole, whether through grazing, signaling, nutrient cycling, or shelter formation. As the journey across these 19 forgotten islands, lost civilizations, and remote ecological guilds reaches its final moment, the Austeron forests serve as a reminder that the world still contains places where complexity unfolds slowly, quietly, and beautifully. These forests stand as a symbol of continuity. Ancient processes still moving, still breathing, still shaping life in ways both mysterious and measurable. If this long exploration has brought you calm, comfort, or quiet curiosity, you can support these journeys by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need a peaceful escape tonight. Your support helps keep these slow, thoughtful stories alive, and it allows this channel to continue exploring new forgotten places, new soft mysteries, and new quiet worlds waiting beyond the horizon.